Before there were pyramids, before there were pharaohs, before Greece had philosophers, or Rome had senators, or India had the Vedas committed to their final written form, there was a civilization so ancient that by the time Egypt began building its first stone monuments, the people of Sumer had already been writing down their laws, their poetry, their medicine, their mathematics, and their theology for over 1,000 years. Not in rough scratches on cave walls, in a fully developed writing system, a system capable of recording abstract thought, legal argument, astronomical observation, and detailed narrative. They were the first, not arguably the first, not among the first. The actual, documented, chronologically confirmed first urban civilization in the history of our species. The first to record a legal system, the first to create schools and formal education, the first to write down a flood story, the first to develop currency and accounting systems, the first to record astronomy with a precision that modern astronomers still examine with genuine respect, the first to chart the movements of visible planets and assign them mathematical periods with an accuracy that raises uncomfortable questions about how they acquired that data without instruments we can identify. And they were the first civilization in human history to write down in their own words, in their own language, on their own tablets, exactly what they believed happened to you when you died. Not gestures, not vague poetic references to the beyond or the great mystery. Specific, detailed, sometimes procedurally precise accounts of what waited on the other side of your last breath. Accounts that were pressed into wet clay, scored with a stylus, dried in the sun or fired in a kiln, stacked in temple libraries, buried in the earth when the cities fell, and discovered thousands of years later by European archaeologists who were, to put it gently, not prepared for the content. The first major discoveries of Sumerian tablets happened in the 19th century, primarily at sites like Nineveh, Nippur, and Ur. The tablets were taken to museums in London, Paris, and Berlin, where scholars spent decades learning to read the strange wedge-shaped script called cuneiform. When they finally could read it fluently, what they found shook biblical scholarship to its foundations. Creation stories that predated Genesis by thousands of years. Flood accounts that Genesis appeared to have directly borrowed from. Legal codes that predated the laws of Moses by centuries. A rich, detailed, sophisticated theological system that had clearly influenced every subsequent religious tradition in the ancient Near East. And a body of thought about death that was unlike anything else in the ancient record, specific enough to map, detailed enough to examine claim by claim, internally consistent enough to function as a system rather than a collection of isolated beliefs. A model of what death actually is, what it actually does to the person who dies, and where the dead actually go, stated not as speculation but as documented fact. Some of what the Sumerians recorded about death is merely strange by modern standards. Strange in ways that feel like the expected strangeness of ancient belief, the unfamiliar cosmology, the different vocabulary, the gods doing things gods don't do in the traditions most of us grew up with. Some of it is stranger than that. Strange in ways that don't map onto any modern religious framework, but that do map with precision that is difficult to dismiss onto things that other ancient civilizations claimed independently, in places and times where no connection to Sumer has been demonstrated. When a belief appears in Sumer, and also independently in ancient Egypt, and also independently in Vedic India, and also independently in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, and also independently in the oldest strata of Chinese mythology, all in essentially the same structural form, the standard, academic explanation of parallel mythological development becomes harder and harder to maintain. What you're left with is either a shared source, so ancient it predates all of these traditions, or a shared experience, multiple human populations, across vast distance and vast time, arriving at the same specific conclusions because those conclusions reflect something real. And one of the things the Sumerians believed about death is something that almost no one who covers this subject wants to say directly. Not because it's gruesome, not because it's violent or disturbing in any ordinary sense, but because if you follow the logic of it all the way to where it leads, if you sit with it long enough, if you test it against everything else the Sumerians recorded, if you hold it next to what modern consciousness research and modern aging science are beginning to discover, it raises questions about the nature of human existence that are very difficult to put back in a box once you've let them out. We're going to get to that thing, but we're going to earn it. We're going to walk through all 8 of the things the Sumerians documented about death. We're going to look at the primary texts, we're going to look at what mainstream scholarship says, and we're going to look at the places where the official academic interpretation and the ancient text itself don't quite line up, where the gap between what the tablet says and what we're told it means is wide enough that something substantial could walk through it. By the time we arrive at the eighth thing, the one nobody wants to hear, you will understand why it is the one that changes everything that came before it. And you will understand why the people who pressed it into clay 4,000 years ago may have known exactly what they were doing. Let's go all the way back. Around 3,500 BCE, give or take a few centuries, depending on which archaeological layer you're examining, in a flat, river-fed, sun-baked alluvial plain between two rivers that the Greeks would eventually call the Tigris and Euphrates, something happened that the standard model of human civilizational development has never been able to fully account for. A civilization appeared. Not gradually, the way civilizations are supposed to appear in the standard model. In the standard model, you get a long, gradual progression. Nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers figure out agriculture over thousands of years, settle into permanent villages, develop pottery and weaving, begin to trade with neighboring villages, slowly accumulate population density, and eventually, across many generations, develop the social complexity required to produce cities, writing, law, and formal religion. That process, in most regions of the world where it occurred, took somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years from the beginning of agriculture to the first recognizable urban centers. In Sumer, the gap was much shorter. The cities appeared with their institutions looking less like the result of a slow evolutionary process and more like the result of a rapid implementation. The writing system didn't evolve gradually from crude pictographs, although some Sumerian scholars would contest this characterization. It appeared in an already complex form, capable of recording nuanced thought almost from its earliest attested stages. The legal system didn't gradually develop from simple tribal customs, it appeared in a codified form. The religious system didn't slowly accumulate from animistic roots, it presented itself in Sumer with a fully articulated theology, a structured pantheon, a detailed cosmology, and a sophisticated eschatology. Where did all of this come from? The Sumerians themselves were quite clear about the answer. They didn't credit their own ingenuity. They didn't attribute their civilization to the hard work of their ancestors across many generations of gradual development. They attributed it to the gods. To beings who came, who descended, who established civilization deliberately and gave it to humanity as a gift with attached obligations. The Sumerians called these beings the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki appears in the earliest Sumerian texts and continues through thousands of years of Mesopotamian religious literature, through the Akkadian Empire that absorbed Sumerian culture, through the Babylonian civilization that absorbed Akkad, through the Assyrian civilization that came after that, all the way into the late antique period. The word and the beings it refers to are continuous through an enormous stretch of documented history. The translation of Anunnaki is contested. Different scholars render it differently. Those who Anu sent from heaven to earth, princely seed or royal offspring, great gods. The most literal reading of the component parts, An, heaven or sky, and Naki or Nuna, offspring, seeds, or those who came, produces something like those who came from the heavens, or the royal offspring of heaven. The specifics of the translation debate matter less than the consistency of the core, meaning these were not earthly beings. They came from somewhere else. They arrived. They established themselves in Sumer, and they brought civilization with them. What happened next, according to the tablets, is the key to everything that follows, including everything the Sumerians believed about death. The Anunnaki created human beings, not in the metaphorical sense that most modern religious thinking uses, not created, meaning spiritually authored or intended or loved into existence. Created in a practical, described, almost procedural sense. The tablets give details. The tablets name participants. The tablets describe the reason for the creation. The Anunnaki's own labor force, a class of lesser gods called the Igigi, had gone on strike. They refused to continue doing the physical work of maintaining the infrastructure of the Anunnaki's civilization. Digging the canals, dredging the rivers, moving the earth. The work was grueling, endless, and the Igigi had finally had enough. The solution developed by the god Enki, the Anunnaki, lord of wisdom, of water, of deep knowledge, the one who occupied the great temple complex at Eridu, the oldest and most sacred city in Sumer, was to create a new kind of being. A being capable of doing the labor the Igigi refused. A being that would maintain the cosmic infrastructure. A being that could be managed. The creation involved mixing. The tablets used specific terminology for what was mixed. The flesh and blood of a slain god, a god with intelligence, a god called Wi-Ila or Geshtui, depending on the text, combined with clay, with the earth itself. The mother goddess, Ninhursag, also called Ninma in some texts, who collaborated with Enki in the creation, shaped the resulting mixture. After several attempts, the tablets describe some failed creations. beings that were malformed or non-viable, the successful human emerged. The Lulu Amalu, the primitive worker, us, now. Here's the critical moment where we have to make a decision about how to proceed. The academic consensus says this is a creation myth. It is a narrative, a story, a pre-scientific attempt by an ancient people to explain where humans came from. It is interesting as anthropology, important as literary history, and completely non-literal as actual cosmology. The Sumerians were doing what all ancient peoples did, making sense of existence through narrative, projecting human social structures onto the cosmos, creating gods in their own image, and assigning to those gods the explanatory power that pre-modern peoples required. That is one way to read the tablets. But there is another way, and the other way has been articulated not only by popular writers who have been extensively criticized by mainstream academia, but by a growing number of serious researchers who look at the actual textual and archaeological evidence, find that the "it's just a myth" explanation generates as many problems as it solves. The Sumerian accounts of the Anunnaki are not written in the style of myth as it appears elsewhere in the ancient world. They are not written in the style of the Greek myths, with their obvious symbolic weight, their clear metaphorical content, their barely disguised commentary on human psychology and social dynamics. They are not written in the style of the Hebrew myths, with their clearly theological purpose of establishing the relationship between one God and one people. They are not written in the style of the Norse myths, with their explicit eschatological function. The Sumerian texts about the Anunnaki read differently. They read like administrative records. They contain specific names, specific cities, specific jurisdictions, specific duties, specific disagreements, specific negotiations, specific dates and events. They read the way government documents read, not the poetry of a people creating a beautiful story about origins, but the bureaucratic record of a people documenting a reality they understood to be historical. The Sumerian word for their creation stories is not the same as the word for their literary fiction. They categorized their own literature, and they knew the difference between a story told for entertainment or instruction and a record preserved for historical purposes. They categorized the Anunnaki accounts as history. This does not make them automatically accurate. People can write bad history. People can mistake legend for history, propaganda for record, oral tradition distorted by time for actual events. We are not claiming that every detail in the Sumerian tablets is literally and precisely true. We are claiming that how we approach these texts as myth or as history matters enormously for how we understand the things they say about death. Because if the Anunnaki were real, if beings came to this planet, created human workers, built a civilization, and then left or remained in forms we don't currently recognize, then everything the Sumerians believed about death exists within that context. The death system they documented is the death system that those specific beings designed and implemented, and that changes the meaning of every one of the 8 things. Let's look at them, one by one. Thing 1. The Great Below, a real place with real laws. The first and most fundamental thing the Sumerians said about death is this: there is a place you go. This sounds almost trivially obvious. Almost every human culture in history has believed in some form of afterlife. The specificity of the Sumerian belief is what distinguishes it. The Sumerians did not say there is something beyond death, or a spiritual realm, or even a heaven for the righteous. They said, there is a specific place. A place with a specific name, specific geography, specific laws, specific rulers, specific population, and specific conditions of existence. A place that functions as an actual place rather than a metaphysical category. They called this place the Kur. Sometimes it was called the Ereshkigal, after its queen. Sometimes the Kigal, the Great Earth, the Great Below. Sometimes simply the Land of No Return. Across the thousands of years of Sumerian and subsequent Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian literature that built upon the Sumerian foundation, the Kur was always there, a consistent, specific, detailed entity. A destination, not a concept. The Kur lay beneath the earth. The Sumerians were not vague about this. They understood the direction of travel to be downward. The dead descended. The direction of descent was not metaphorical. In multiple texts, the actual physical process of descent is described: the dead traveling downward through layers of the earth, through regions of increasing darkness and constriction, toward a place that was separated from the land of the living by a great body of water. That water is described differently in different texts. Sometimes it is a river, the river of death, that Greek mythology would later call the Styx. Sometimes it is a sea, an uncrossable expanse between the world of the living and the world of the dead. In all versions, it is a boundary, a hard boundary, a separation that is not simply spatial but ontological crossing. It changes what you are. On the other side of the water, a city, The Sumerians described the land of the dead as a city. It had walls. It had gates, specifically 7 gates. It had an interior with its own geography, its own districts, its own hierarchies of location within which the different categories of dead were placed. It had a palace, the palace of the Queen of the Dead. It had a throne. It was organized. It was administered. The gates deserve particular attention because they are one of the most consistently described features of the Sumerian underworld across all the texts, and because the specificity of their number 7 appears not to be arbitrary. 7 is the number that appears throughout Sumerian cosmological and theological systems. 7 heavens, 7 divine judges, 7 tablets of creation. 7 is the number of the Anunnaki of the underworld. Specifically, there are 7 great judges who sit before the throne of Ereshkigal. 7 days of the week derived from Sumerian astronomical theology. 7 was not a decorative or mystical number in Sumer. It was a structural number. A number that indicated completeness, fullness, the full range of a system. 7 gates suggests a complete system, a system that covers every dimension of the journey from life to death. We know the details of the passage through these gates because of one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world, the descent of Inanna to the great below. Inanna, in the later Akkadian tradition, called Ishtar, is the great goddess of Sumer. She is the goddess of love and war simultaneously, a pairing that might seem strange to modern sensibility but that the Sumerians understood as reflecting a single underlying principle, the power that drives desire, that drives the will toward its object, regardless of whether that object is a lover or an enemy. She is the planet Venus in Sumerian astronomy, the brilliant morning and evening star, the one that appears at the liminal boundaries of day and night, always on the edge. And in this astonishing poem, she goes down. No one does this. The living do not descend to the Kur. It is the place of the dead, and the living do not visit it. It is the fundamental law of the cosmos as the Sumerians understood it. The living live above the earth, the dead go below it, and the two realms are separated by the uncrossable water. Inanna is a goddess. She has power that mortals don't possess. But this decision to descend is still presented as something audacious. Something that required preparation and precautions. Something genuinely dangerous. The text tells us she set her ear to the great below. She turned her attention to it. She made her decision. She prepared herself, hung the me on herself, the divine attributes and powers that she would carry on her body, and she descended. When she arrived at the gates of the Kur, she encountered the gatekeeper, a figure named Neti. Neti went to Ereshkigal, the Queen of the Dead, who was also Inanna's sister, to announce her arrival and receive instructions. And Ereshkigal's response was not what you might expect if you imagine the Queen of the Dead as a simple villain, eager to trap the living in her realm. Ereshkigal struck her thigh. She bit her lip. These are gestures of distress in Sumerian convention. She was distressed by the news that Inanna had come to the underworld. She was not pleased. She was disturbed. And then she gave instructions that were nonetheless absolute. Inanna must pass through the gates, as all beings pass through the gates. No one enters the great below except on the terms of the great below. No exceptions, not even for a goddess. Neti returned to the first gate and informed Inanna. At each gate, the gatekeeper took something. The crown from her head, the small lapis lazuli stones from her ears, the necklace of lapis from her neck, the breastplate called the "Come Man Come" from her chest, the golden ring from her hand, the lapis lazuli measuring rod and line from her hand, the royal robe called the pala garment from her body. At each gate, Inanna asked why. At each gate, the answer was the same. Quiet, Inanna. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. She arrived in the land of the dead naked, stripped of every divine attribute, every marker of her identity and power. She had entered as a goddess. She arrived as a naked being. Ereshkigal fixed her eye upon her, the eye of death, the texts call it, and killed her. Inanna's corpse was hung on a hook, left there, in the darkness. 3 days and 3 nights passed in the land of the dead with Inanna's corpse on the hook. Above the earth, in the land of the living, the consequences were catastrophic. All sexual reproduction ceased. Animals stopped mating. Plants stopped seeding. Bulls did not mount cows. Men did not approach women. The generative force of the universe had gone into the earth, and the world above was dying. Because the goddess of love and fertility was a corpse in the underworld, love and fertility had left the world. Inanna had instructed her servant Ninshubur before she descended, "If I do not return in 3 days and 3 nights, go to the gods, go to Enlil, go to Nana, go to Enki. Tell them what has happened. Plead for my rescue." Ninshubur did this. Enlil refused to help. Nana refused to help. Only Enki acted. and Enki's action is instructive in ways that most treatments of this text overlook. Enki did not go to the underworld himself. He could not. The law of the Kur applied even to the gods, perhaps especially to the gods. He could not simply descend, retrieve Inanna, and return. The law of the land of no return was absolute. But Enki was the god of wisdom. He understood the law well enough to work around it. He took dirt from under his fingernail and created two small beings. Beings so small and so featureless that they could pass through the gates of the underworld undetected. The gatekeepers, checking for living beings, did not notice them. These small beings were given the water of life and the food of life. They were instructed to find Ereshkigal and to mirror her pain. This is one of the most psychologically sophisticated details in all of Sumerian literature. Ereshkigal was in pain. She was crying out. The text describes her as moaning, like a woman in labor. And Enki's beings were not to overpower her, not to deceive her, not to steal Inanna's body back by force. They were simply to be present with her pain, to witness it, to say, when she cried, my inside, oh your inside, to reflect her anguish back to her in an act of pure, compassionate presence. And Ereshkigal, the queen of death, the ruler of the land of no return, was so moved by being witnessed in her pain that she offered the small beings a gift. They could have anything they wanted from the underworld. They asked for the corpse on the hook. They sprinkled it with the water of life. They gave it the food of life. Inanna rose. But then came the condition. As Inanna began to ascend through the gates, the Anunnaki of the underworld, the great judges who presided over the realm of the dead, seized her. She could not leave. No one leaves the land of no return without providing a substitute. The law was absolute. If Inanna goes up, someone must come down to replace her. A soul for a soul. The accounts must balance. Inanna was released, but she carried with her a retinue of demons, the Gala, the underworld demons, whose job was to collect the substitute. They could not be moved by weeping. They could not be appealed to with food or drink. They had one function, to find the being who would take Inanna's place in the Kur. This is the first thing the Sumerians said about death, and I want to sit with it for a moment longer, because its implications extend far beyond this single story. The law of the land of no return is the bedrock of Sumerian death theology. No one leaves without being replaced. The accounts must balance. The dead in the Kur are not there by accident or by tragedy. They are there as a necessary condition of the structure of existence. The underworld must be populated. It is not a punishment, not a prison, not even simply a destination. It is a system. A system that requires and maintains a certain population of the dead, that has rules governing who enters and under what conditions, that has administrators who enforce those rules even against the most powerful beings in the cosmos. The implication is profound. Death is not something that happens to you. Death is something the system does to you. The system that does it has rules. Those rules were established, not grown, not evolved, not emerged from the nature of things. Established by someone, for reasons. The Kur is not chaos. It is administered. And the administration of it is connected in ways we will explore as we move through all 8 of the things to the same beings who created human beings in the first place. Now, let's look at a parallel that the academic consensus tends to minimize because of its inconvenience. The Sumerian Kur, its structure, its features, its queen, its gatekeeping function, its rule of no return, its water boundary appears in the ancient record of virtually every civilization that has left us detailed theological documentation. Not as a vague idea of an afterlife, but as a structurally similar system with the same key features. The Egyptian Duat, the underworld through which the dead travel in the Amduat, the text inscribed in royal tombs, has 12 regions corresponding to the 12 hours of the night. It has gates. It has a queen, in the form of Nephthys, who rules the west, the direction of death. It has a court of judgment. It has specific conditions for specific categories of the dead. Its structure is more elaborate than the Sumerian Kur in some ways, but it contains all the same elements. The Babylonian and Assyrian traditions, which directly absorbed Sumerian theology, preserve the Kur essentially unchanged, renaming Inanna as Ishtar and Ereshkigal as Ereshkigal, essentially unchanged and adding detail without altering structure. The Hebrew Sheol, described in the Old Testament as the realm of the dead, translated as the pit or the grave, has features that align with the Kur in ways that scholarship has long recognized as reflecting a shared ancient Near Eastern tradition. It is underground. It is a place of diminished existence. The dead there are shades, the Rephaim in Hebrew, diminished beings who retain some form of consciousness but are less than what they were in life. The Greek Hades, which appears in the Homeric epics, and then in increasingly elaborate form through the classical period, contains every structural element of the Sumerian Kur. It is underground, It is accessed by crossing a body of water, the river Styx. It has gatekeepers, Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guards the entrance. It has a king and queen, Hades and Persephone's myth of descending to the underworld and returning bears obvious structural similarities to Inanna's descent. It has judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, Aeacus. It has specific regions for specific categories of dead. It has the Elysian Fields for the special dead, and the Asphodel Meadows for the ordinary dead, and Tartarus for the specially punished. The Norse underworld Niflheim and Hell has the same basic structure. Underground. A queen, Hel, from whose name the English word hell derives. Regions for different categories of dead. The Vedic underworld Naraka presided over by Yama, the god of death. Gates, judges, different regions for different categories of dead. This is too consistent to be explained by the standard anthropological argument about universal human responses to death producing parallel mythologies. That argument explains similarity of concept, yes. All cultures imagine an afterlife of some kind. It does not explain similarity of specific structural features. You do not independently arrive at 7 gates, a water boundary, a queen who did not choose her domain, and a system of soul sustenance through living offerings by the independent operation of the same human psychological processes in different places. The convergence in specific features points to a single shared source. A source that predates all of these traditions, or possibly a shared actual experience that different civilizations recorded in their own vocabularies. The Sumerians were the first to write it down. And what they wrote was specific enough that when you find the same specific features in every subsequent tradition, the most parsimonious explanation is not independent invention. It is transmission from a common origin, an origin that predates Sumer itself. That possibility that what the Sumerians documented about death was not invented but reported, transmitted from an even earlier source, is one that we will carry through this entire examination. The first thing the Sumerians said about death: there is a real place. It has a name, it has geography, it has laws, it is governed. It was created designed with specific features that serve specific functions. And the fact that those same specific features appear, independently, in the death theologies of every major ancient civilization suggests that what the Sumerians were documenting was not a local mythological creation. It was a universal reality. A universal reality that some very old tradition knew and transmitted, and that the Sumerians were among the first to write down. The Great Below exists. The Sumerians said so. And the rest of the ancient world, in every language and every geography it occupied, said so too. Thing 2. The 7 gates and the systematic dismantling of who you are. The second thing the Sumerians said about death is not just that there is a destination. It is that getting there destroys you, systematically, deliberately, in stages. We touched on Inanna's 7-gate stripping process. We need to go much deeper. Because those 7 gates are not just a dramatic device in a story about a goddess's adventure, they are a model. A specific, detailed model of what death does to the human self. And that model, if you examine it carefully, is one of the most sophisticated philosophical statements about personal identity and its limits to survive from the ancient world. Let's begin with a question that the academic commentary on these texts rarely asks: why 7? Not 5, not 3, not 10. 7 specific gates, each of which takes a specific thing. Why this number, and why these specific things? The Sumerians were precise thinkers. The same civilization that produced accurate astronomical tables and complex legal codes did not choose arbitrary numbers for theological claims. 7 gates, removing 7 specific items, mapping onto 7 specific dimensions of Sumerian divine identity, this is a structural argument. The 7 gates are claiming something about the structure of identity itself, that the self has 7 layers. That death removes them one by one. That what arrives in the land of the dead is what is left when all 7 layers have been taken. Let's examine each layer in detail, because the cumulative picture is extraordinary. The first gate takes the crown. In Sumerian cosmological thought, the crown is not simply a symbol of power. It is a connector, specifically a connector to the divine realm above. The Sumerian king was the intermediary between the gods and humanity. His crown was the physical marker of that intermediary function. It connected him to the heavens from which the Anunnaki descended, and from which authority over the earth was distributed. To lose the crown at the first gate of death is to lose your connection to the transcendent source of authority. You enter death already separated from the divine hierarchy above. You are, from the first gate, cut off from heaven. The second gate takes the lapis lazuli stones from the ears. Lapis lazuli deserves considerable attention. This was not an ordinary gemstone to the Sumerians. It came from Afghanistan, from the Sar-e-Sang mines in Badakhshan province, a trade journey of thousands of miles. It was the most precious stone in the ancient Near East, and remained so for thousands of years. Its deep blue color, flecked with gold pyrite, made it look like a fragment of the night sky. It was the stone of the gods. It was used to decorate the eyes of divine statues, giving them the gaze of heaven looking through stone. The lapis stones at the ears were not decorative. In Sumerian symbolism, the ear, specifically the ear's capacity to receive sound, was the faculty of divine communication. The great hymns to the gods contain constant references to the god's ear, to whether the god is listening, to the supplicant's wish that the god would turn the great ear toward them. The ear is the receiver of divine speech. To lose the lapis stones from the ears at the second gate is to lose the capacity to hear divine communication. You enter the second layer of death already deaf to the gods. The third gate takes the necklace of lapis from the neck. The neck in Sumerian thought is the seat of the voice, of speech, of the capacity to name things and to communicate. The power of divine speech, the me that governs the ability to issue commands that reality must obey, resided metaphorically in the throat and neck. In Sumerian creation theology, the world was often described as being spoken into existence. The gods named things into being. Speech was creative. To lose the necklace at the third gate is to lose the capacity for creative speech. You can no longer name things into being, no longer command through the divine word, no longer participate in the verbal creative act. The fourth gate takes the come breastplate from the chest. This is the seat of the life force, the generator of attraction and desire, the capacity to draw life toward you. The Sumerian word for heart was also used to describe the center of will, of desire, of the vital force that animated the body. To lose the breastplate at the fourth gate is to lose the generative pull, the magnetic quality of the living that draws other living things toward them. You become inert, passive, no longer capable of attracting or generating. The fifth gate takes the golden ring from the hand. In Sumerian administrative practice, a ring was a seal. It was the mark of identity, verified the legal proof that you were who you said you were. When a king sealed a document, the ring was the instrument of that sealing. It made the document legally valid because it confirmed identity beyond dispute. To lose the ring at the fifth gate is to lose verified identity. You are no longer who you say you are in any legally cognizable sense. Your claim to be yourself has been dissolved. The sixth gate takes the lapis lazuli measuring rod and line. This is perhaps the most theologically significant item on the list, and the one that deserves the most careful examination. The measuring rod and line were not merely practical tools. They were the instruments of cosmic justice, the tools by which the gods established the boundaries of kingdoms, measured the courses of rivers, and determined the fates of human beings. When the sun god Utu, who was the god of justice, is described in hymns, he is often depicted with the measuring rod and line. They are the instruments of righteous judgment, of the proper ordering of reality according to divine law. To possess them is to stand in a relationship to cosmic justice, to be subject to it, to be measurable by it, to be part of the ordered cosmos that the rod and line define. To lose them at the sixth gate is to step outside that ordered cosmos. You are no longer a measurable being. You are no longer subject to the laws of the living world. You exist in a space outside the framework of cosmic justice. The seventh gate takes the royal robe, the pala garment. The pala is the most complete symbol. It is the full outer integument of the divine being, not just clothing in the ordinary sense, but the visible, complete expression of identity as worn in the world. It is the self as it presents itself to others. The robe is what others see when they look at you and recognize who you are. To lose it is to lose the final layer of social and cosmic identity. You stand before the land of the dead in absolute nakedness. No crown connecting you to the heavens, no ears to hear the divine, no voice to speak the divine, no vital force to generate desire, no ring to prove who you are, no rod and line to maintain your relationship with cosmic order, no robe to show others who you were. What remains? The Sumerians called what remained the gidim, the shade, the ghost, the diminished echo of the person who was alive. Here is what is extraordinary about this model. It doesn't say the self disappears. It says the self is reduced systematically, layer by layer, to something more fundamental than any of the layers that were removed. The gidim exists. It persists in the kur. It is not nothing, but it is not what it was. It is the irreducible remainder after 7 stages of removal. This raises an absolutely crucial question. What is the gidim? What is the nature of this irreducible remainder? What survives all 7 gates? The Sumerian texts are, at this point, deliberately not explicit. They describe what the Giddim does. It can appear in dreams. It can be communicated with under specific ritual conditions. It retains some form of awareness. It responds to offerings and to the speaking of its name, but they do not describe what it fundamentally is. This may be a deliberate theological silence, or it may simply be the limit of what the tablets preserved, or what was knowable. But the model itself, the seven-stage removal of layers of selfhood, leaving an irreducible core that continues to exist in a different realm, is a philosophical claim about the structure of personal identity that is more sophisticated than almost anything in subsequent Western philosophy, until the 20th century. Most Western philosophical traditions, from Plato onward, have struggled with the relationship between the soul and the body. Where most of them go wrong in retrospect, and from the vantage point of the Sumerian model, is treating the self as a binary. You have a body and you have a soul, and when the body dies, the soul either continues or it doesn't. The Sumerian model is not binary, it is multi-layered. The self has 7 distinguishable aspects, and they are removed in sequence. Death is not a switch that flips from on to off. Death is a process of progressive reduction. This resonates deeply with what modern consciousness research is beginning to understand about what happens at death. Near-death experience with what we search, which is now a legitimate academic field with peer-reviewed publications, major conferences, and data collected from hundreds of thousands of cases across every culture that has been studied, consistently reports a specific phenomenological structure to the experience of clinical death. There is typically an initial phase of consciousness separating from the body, then a passage through something described as a tunnel, a dark passage, a movement through space, then an arrival somewhere different. Then, for many, a review of the life that was lived. Then, sometimes, contact with deceased relatives or beings of light. Then, for those who return, a forced or chosen reversal of the process. The structure of the near-death experience, particularly the initial separation and passage maps, in its broad features, onto the 7-gate stripping process. Not perfectly. The phenomenological accounts don't mention crowns or measuring rods. But the experience of losing attachment to things that constituted ordinary identity, the body, the social role, the personal history, the physical sensations, and arriving at something more essential, something that the experiencer typically reports feels more real than ordinary identity rather than less. This is structurally similar to what the 7 gates describe. There is another dimension of the 7 gates that almost no popular treatment of Sumerian theology ever discusses, and it is perhaps the most disturbing. The 7 gates don't just describe what death takes from you. They describe what the Anunnaki built into the structure of death. These gates were not naturally occurring. The Kur was not a pre-existing feature of the universe into which the Anunnaki inserted themselves. The Sumerian texts describe the underworld as created, organized, structured, designed. The gates were put there, the gatekeepers were appointed. The laws of passage were established, which means that the systematic stripping of selfhood that occurs at the 7 gates is not a natural consequence of dying. It is a designed consequence. Someone decided that the dead would arrive in the Kur with their divine attributes removed. Someone decided that the journey from life to death would involve losing your connection to the heavens, losing your divine hearing, losing your creative voice, losing your vital generative force, losing your verified identity, losing your relationship to cosmic justice, and losing the visible expression of yourself. Why would you design death to do that? What is the benefit to the designers of having the dead arrive stripped of all of these things? These are questions we will come back to, because the answer is not comfortable and it touches directly on the 8th thing, the one nobody wants to hear. But hold these questions in mind as we proceed. The design of the stripping process is not incidental. It is central to understanding what the Sumerian death system was built to accomplish. The second thing the Sumerians said about death, it unmakes you in 7 stages. Each stage removes a specific layer of what you were in life. The process is deliberate. The laws of the gates cannot be questioned or appealed. What arrives in the Kur is not you as you were. It is the irreducible core of what you are when everything else has been removed. And the removal was designed by the same beings who designed you. Thing 3. The food of the dead. Why consciousness requires maintenance. Here is a detail from Sumerian death theology that is so strange, so counterintuitive, so resistant to easy categorization as primitive animism that most treatments of this subject either skip over it or mention it in passing without examining its full implications. In the Kur, the dead need to eat, not metaphorically, not as a quaint cultural belief in the afterlife of physical needs. The Sumerian texts are consistent, repeated, and detailed on this point. The Giddim, the shade, the diminished consciousness of the dead requires sustenance in the underworld. They eat, Or more precisely, they require something that functions as food and drink, and if they do not receive it, their condition deteriorates. They suffer. They become what the Sumerian texts call the hungry ghost, a shade that has not been fed, that exists in a state of misery, that may return to haunt the living not from malice but from desperation and need. Let's look at the full scope of this belief, because its implications are enormous. The Sumerian ritual system was built around the obligation of the living to feed the dead. The kispu, the funerary feast, was performed monthly, at the new moon. It was not optional. It was not merely an expression of grief or a cultural custom. It was a legal obligation. In the same Sumerian law codes that governed property rights, commercial contracts, and criminal penalties, the obligation to perform the kispu for one's dead relatives was written as law. Failure to perform it was a legal violation. Why would the most administratively sophisticated civilization of the ancient world write into its laws an obligation to feed the dead unless they genuinely believed the dead were being fed? Unless the ritual was understood not as symbolic commemoration but as actual transmission of something to actual beings in an actual place. The kispu ceremony involved gathering family members at the tomb. Offerings of food and drink were made specific foods, specific quantities, placed in specific ways. The names of the dead were spoken aloud. They were invited to join the meal. They were addressed directly, in second person, as present entities participating in the event. The speaking of names was not incidental. In Sumerian and Egyptian and Hebrew thought, the name was not just a label. The name was a component of the self, a real part of what a person was, not merely a convenient linguistic tag attached to them. The name carried something of the person's essence. And as long as the name was spoken by the living, that something, that essential component of the dead person's identity, was being activated, reinforced, maintained. This is why the worst fate the Sumerian texts describe for the dead is not the worst physical condition in the Kur, not the most degraded existence as a hungry, unremembered shade. The worst fate is to become nameless. To be forgotten. To have no one living who speaks your name. Because when your name ceases to be spoken, the last living connection to your existence in this world is severed, and the process of dissolution that began at the seven gates accelerates toward its terminus. But the kispu was not the only mechanism of feeding the dead. The Sumerian temple cult, the system of regular offerings made to the gods in the great temples, had a dead-feeding component that is rarely discussed. The offerings made in the temple precincts were not only for the gods. A portion of every offering was directed to the dead ancestors, the accumulated dead of the community, the great chain of the departed, stretching back to the beginning of the civilization. The temple cult fed both the living gods and the dead humans simultaneously, in a single system of offering that recognized both populations as requiring sustenance. Now let's examine what this implies philosophically. Because the implications are extraordinary if you follow them. The standard materialist model of consciousness says, consciousness is a product of the physical brain. When the brain dies, consciousness ceases. There is no after, because the substrate that generates consciousness, the electrochemical activity of neural tissue, has stopped. The specific patterns that constituted you dissolve back into the matter from which they came. The information is lost. The experience is over. This model does not accommodate the possibility of dead people needing food. If consciousness ceases at death, there is nothing left to need anything. The entire structure of the kispu, the legal obligation, the specific rituals, the careful speaking of names, is built around a premise that the materialist model considers impossible. The Sumerian model says something different and more complex. Consciousness continues after death. We'll address the evidence for this more fully in the section on communication between the worlds, but it continues in a diminished form that requires maintenance. The Giddim is not self-sustaining. Its continued existence in the Kur depends on a constant input of something from the living world. Without that input, it degrades. It diminishes. Eventually, it may dissolve almost entirely, not into nothing, because the Sumerian texts never quite say nothing, but into something so formless that it barely functions as a self at all. This model of post-mortem consciousness, as continuing but requiring maintenance, as subject to degradation without external input, is structurally similar to something that emerged in 20th and 21st century physics. Specifically, to the concept of quantum decoherence. Quantum mechanics describes a world in which information can exist in a state of superposition, multiple possibilities simultaneously maintained, until an interaction with the environment forces a specific outcome. This state of maintained superposition, called quantum coherence, requires specific conditions. It requires isolation from random thermal perturbations from the environment. Without that isolation, the coherent quantum state degrades. It decoheres. It collapses into classical states that contain less information, less possibility, less order. The theoretical work of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, their orchestrated objective reduction, ORC-OR theory of consciousness, proposes that consciousness arises from quantum processes in the microtubules of neural cells, and that these quantum processes are maintained through specific biological mechanisms that protect them from environmental decoherence. This theory remains controversial within mainstream neuroscience and physics, but it has not been definitively refuted and continues to attract serious scientific attention. If consciousness has a quantum basis, then what happens at death takes on a different character. The biological mechanisms that maintained quantum coherence in the brain that prevented the quantum processes underlying consciousness from decohering are removed. The consciousness doesn't necessarily cease. It transitions. It moves from a state of maintained coherence into a state of ongoing decoherence, a state of gradual information loss, of progressive dissolution that could continue for some time after the physical death of the body. And in that state of ongoing decoherence, an input of coherent information, an input of organized attention, maintained as ordered pattern, could theoretically slow or partially counteract the decoherence process. Could maintain the quantum information at a level above what it would otherwise collapse to. The living speaking the names of the dead. The living making offerings and directing attention toward the dead. The living performing the kispu and actively maintaining the connection between the living world and the dead consciousness. This is not the food and drink of the physical world, but it is a form of coherent, ordered, organized information, input, attention, intention, recognition directed at a specific consciousness that, without that input, continues to decohere toward dissolution. We are not claiming the Sumerians knew quantum physics. What we are saying is that when an ancient theological model and a modern scientific framework independently arrive at the same structural description of a phenomenon, a consciousness that requires maintenance, that degrades without input, that benefits from specific kinds of organized attention from external sources, that convergence is not something to dismiss. Now, let's go deeper into the specific content of what the Sumerian texts say about how different categories of dead fare in the underworld. Because the variations in condition are revealing in ways that touch directly on the eighth thing. The Gilgamesh epic, specifically the section called Bilgamesh in the Netherworld, contains what is essentially a survey of underworld conditions, delivered by the dead Enkidu to his living companion Gilgamesh. Enkidu has been to the Kur, he has seen it, and Gilgamesh asks him, with the pragmatic directness of a man who knows he will eventually be joining the dead, "Tell me what you saw." The warrior who died in battle and has many sons to perform the funerary rites for him, he rests on a couch and drinks pure water. Comfortable. His condition in the underworld is good. The man who was buried with his grave goods, whose burial was complete and proper, he also does well in the Kur. His shade is supported by the objects placed with him. The man who died suddenly, without warning, without proper burial preparation, his shade lies on the ground and laps water from puddles. Undignified. Insufficient. The man who has no one to speak his name, no sons, no relatives, no one to perform the kispu, he eats scraps. The worst of what falls from tables. The dregs of what others are offered. The man who died in fire, his shade is described as rising in smoke to the sky. Formless, diffuse, barely coherent. What this catalog reveals is crucial. The quality of your existence in the Kur is not determined by your moral virtue in life. It is determined by your social connections, by whether you had people to mourn you properly, to bury you correctly, to speak your name, to make offerings on your behalf. And it is determined by the circumstances and manner of your death. This is a profoundly social model of the afterlife. And it is one that radically distinguishes Sumerian death theology from the moral accounting models that most subsequent traditions developed: the Egyptian weighing of the heart, the Christian heaven and hell based on faith and works, the Hindu karma system, the Islamic judgment. In those traditions, what matters is what you did. In the Sumerian system, what matters is who remembers you and whether the proper rituals were performed. This is not an accidental distinction. It reflects a specific theological claim that the quality of your afterlife is a function of your social embeddedness in the living community. You are not judged as an individual soul by a cosmic moral tribunal. You are sustained or abandoned by the community of the living that you were part of. Your existence after death is continuous with your existence before death, in the sense that it depends on the same social relationships that sustained you in life. There is a philosophical position called social constructivism, the view that the self is not a pre-given entity that exists independently and then enters into social relationships, but rather that the self is constituted by and through those relationships. You are not you in isolation. You are you as defined by your connections to others, your roles in social structures, your relationships to the living network of which you are a part. The Sumerian model of the afterlife is a radical extension of this position. The self, the Gedem, continues after death, but its quality of existence depends on whether the social network that partly constituted it continues to maintain the connection. When the living community performs the kispu and speaks the name and makes the offerings, they are not just commemorating a dead person. They are actively maintaining the portion of that person's identity that was relational, that lived in the connection between the dead person and the living community. When that connection is severed, when no one speaks the name, when no one makes offerings, when the dead are forgotten, what was maintained by the connection dissolves. The irreducible core of the Gedem remains, perhaps, but the richer relational self that constituted the person's identity in life cannot persist without being maintained. This implies something deeply important about identity, that what we call the self is not a fixed, bounded, isolated entity that happens to have relationships. It is fundamentally relational all the way down. It is what it is, partly because of the relationships that constitute it. And when those relationships are severed first by death, then by forgetting, what remains is less than what was. Not nothing, but less. Now, let's bring in the context that we mentioned earlier, and that becomes increasingly important as we proceed through all 8 of the things. If the Anunnaki created human beings as a labor force, as entities designed to serve the needs of beings more powerful than themselves, then the question of what the Anunnaki derived from human existence becomes crucial for understanding why death is structured the way it is. The Sumerian texts are clear that the gods received something from human worship. Temple offerings, food, drink, precious materials, the labor of building and maintaining temples were understood as literally feeding the gods. The hymns sung in temples gave the gods something. The rituals performed in their honor provided something. The Sumerian word for this provision is not entirely clear in terms of what it refers to in substance, but it is clearly conceived as a real transaction rather than a symbolic one. Human devotion provided the gods with something they actually required. This is consistent with the structure of the cosmos as the Sumerian texts describe it. Every level of existence is in a relationship of need with every other level. The lesser gods needed the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki needed human offerings. The dead needed offerings from the living. The entire cosmological hierarchy is a system in which sustenance flows upward from humans to gods, and maintenance flows in specific directions downward from gods to cosmos, from living to dead. Consider the architecture of this system as an economist might. You have a hierarchy of beings. The top of the hierarchy, the Anunnaki, extracts value from the middle of the hierarchy, living humans. Living humans extract value from the bottom of the hierarchy, the dead, through the labor they no longer have to perform, and from the earth itself, through agriculture. And the dead are maintained at minimal levels by the living, just enough to sustain their existence, but not enough for comfort unless the kispu is performed. This is an economic system. Not metaphorically, structurally. It has a hierarchy, it has flows of value, it has extraction at the top and maintenance at the bottom, it has specific rules governing the transactions at each level, and the most important rule of all, the rule that governs the most fundamental transaction in the system, is this: humans die. Humans do not accumulate. Humans do not persist through time long enough to become economically independent of the system. Humans generate their output, their labor, their offerings, their devotion, and then they die and are replaced by new humans who begin generating again. The third thing the Sumerians said about death: the dead require sustenance that only the living can provide. Their continued existence in the Kur depends on a constant flow of attention, ritual, and named remembrance from the living. The system is designed so that this flow is required, meaning that the living are always in a relationship of obligation to the dead, and the dead are always in a state of dependence on the living. This mutual dependence is not accidental. It is structural. It was built in, and it serves a system in which the extraction of value from human existence, both living and dead, benefits something above both of them. The third thing, like the first two, points to a design. Not a nature, not an inevitability, a design, a system. A choice made by beings who had reasons for what they built. Those reasons are what the eighth thing is about. Thing 4. The divine tablets of fate, who controls your death and why. The fourth thing the Sumerians said about death requires understanding one of the most difficult and important concepts in all of Sumerian thought, something called the me. The me, pronounced may, appear throughout Sumerian religious literature from the earliest texts to the latest. They are not laws in any sense we would recognize. They are not physical constants. They are not divine commandments. They are something altogether more fundamental and more difficult to translate into modern categories. The closest approximation in modern language might be operational parameters of existence. The me are the divine principles that govern the functioning of reality, not just moral or legal reality, but the entire spectrum of what happens in the cosmos. They are specific, innumerable, and can apparently be possessed, transferred, stolen, and lost. We know the me can be enumerated because the Sumerians enumerated them. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, one of the most important texts for understanding Sumerian cosmological thought, Inanna travels to Enki's temple at Eridu and obtains the me through a combination of drinking, flattery, and divine sleight of hand. And the list of what she obtained recorded in the tablet gives us the clearest inventory of the me that has survived. The list is remarkable in its scope and its specificity. Among the me enumerated, kingship, the divine office, the exalted and enduring crown, the throne of kingship, the exalted scepter, the royal insignia, the exalted shrine, shepherdship, kingship, the priestly office, the functions of Inanna, the musical instruments of the descent to the underworld, the ascent from the underworld, the art of song, the art of the hero, the power of the weapon, the black garment, the colorful garment, the loosening of the hair, the binding of the hair, the standard, the quiver, the art of lovemaking, the kissing, the art of prostitution, the art of forthright speech, the art of slanderous speech, the art of ornamental smithing, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the builder, the craft of the basket weaver, the rites, wisdom, attention, the descent to the underworld, the ascent from the underworld, the scribal art, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the builder, the craft of the basket weaver, wisdom, attention, holy purification, fear, consternation, bitter weeping, rejoicing of heart, deceit, the rebel land, goodness, justice, the descent to the underworld, the ascent from the underworld. The list continues for more than 100 items. What this catalog tells us is that the Sumerians understood every significant aspect of existence, every human activity, every social institution, every emotional state, every craft, every aspect of both life and death as governed by a specific divine principle that could be held, transferred, or lost. Reality was not self-governing. Every feature of what happened in the world was governed by a corresponding me held by a specific deity. Now, here is what this means for death specifically. Among the me specifically listed in the catalog from the Inanna and Enki text are the descent to the underworld and the ascent from the underworld. These are me. They are divine principles governing the mechanics of dying and, under specific circumstances, the mechanics of return from death. The descent to the underworld is a me. This is an extraordinary claim. It means that your death is not something that simply happens to you because biology runs out or the body fails. Your death is an event governed by a divine principle, a me that is held and administered by the gods. The fact that you die not just when and how, but the fundamental fact that you die at all is a function of the me of descent, and the me are controlled by the Anunnaki. This is the fourth thing the Sumerians said about death, and it is the one that most thoroughly undermines every modern assumption about mortality. In the Sumerian worldview, you do not die because death is the inevitable terminus of biological life. You die because a cosmic system designed to include death is operating as intended. Death is not a law of nature. It is a me. It is an administrative code. It is something that was established that could, in principle, be different, but which was set this way for reasons. Let's explore the full context of this claim, because it is supported by multiple independent textual sources. The text most explicitly addressing the designed nature of human mortality is the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest complete narratives to survive from Mesopotamia, probably composed in the early 2nd millennium BCE from earlier oral traditions. The Atrahasis epic tells the story of human creation and survival through multiple attempts at divine destruction. It is also the most explicit statement in any surviving Sumerian or Akkadian text of the designed nature of human mortality. The opening of the Atrahasis epic describes the situation before human creation. The Anunnaki, the great gods, had assigned the Agigi, the lesser gods, the work of maintaining cosmic infrastructure. Digging the rivers, excavating the canals that made agriculture possible in Mesopotamia, doing the physically exhausting labor of terraforming a civilization's foundation. The Agigi worked for 40 years. And then they revolted. The tablets describe the revolt in vivid terms. The Agigi set fire to their tools. They surrounded the house of Enlil, the great god of authority, at night, crying out. They refused to continue. The work was too hard. The labor was too heavy. They would not do it. This was a genuine crisis for the Anunnaki. The infrastructure of their civilization depended on this labor. Without the canals, agriculture collapsed. Without agriculture, the temples had no offerings. Without offerings, the gods in the Sumerian theological framework were deprived of their sustenance. The system broke down. Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag, in some versions the goddess Mami or Beletili, proposed a solution. Create a being capable of bearing the labor. Mix the blood and flesh of a god, a willing sacrificed god, with clay, and form a new kind of worker. Not a god, but not merely animal either. Something capable of understanding and following instructions, capable of learning skills, capable of doing the work the Igigi refused, the Lulu Amalu, the primitive worker. The creation is described in extraordinary detail in the Atrahasis text. 14 pieces of clay are prepared, 7 for the left and 7 for the right, again the number 7 appearing at a structural node. The blood of the slain god is mixed in. Ninhursag shapes them. Enki presides. After a period of gestation described in the text in terms that parallel human pregnancy, the first humans emerge. They take up the tools the Igigi put down. They begin to work. The problem is then solved. For a while, the humans multiply. As they multiply, they make noise. More noise than the gods expected. The text uses a specific word for this. The noise the humans make disturbs the gods' sleep. This noise is not random sound. The word used has implications of clamor, of pressing upward, of disturbance in the divine order. The humans, in their multiplicity and their activity, create a disturbance in the cosmic hierarchy. Enlil, the god of authority and order, finds this intolerable. He is the one who most consistently objects to humanity's existence throughout the Atrahasis epic. He sends plagues. The plagues reduce the human population significantly. But the humans survive partly because Enki, who is described as both humanity's creator and its protector, albeit a protector with complicated motives, helps them find ways to propitiate the specific god of plague and reduce the disease's impact. When the humans recover and multiply again, Enlil sends drought and famine. Again the humans suffer. Again they find ways to survive, with Enki's subtle assistance. Finally, Enlil sends the flood. This is the Sumerian flood story, older than the biblical version and clearly its source, a fact that troubled 19th and early 20th century biblical scholars enormously when it was first translated. The flood was total. It was designed to kill every living human being. The other great gods agreed to it, even Enki, who signed the agreement and the covenant was sealed. But Enki found a way around his covenant. He did not directly warn the human Atrahasis, the Sumerian Noah. He spoke to the wall. He addressed a reed hut in which Atrahasis was sleeping, and told the wall to hear his words, the wall to pass along the message. Technically, he was speaking to a wall, not to a person. The wall happened to convey the message, and Atrahasis built a boat. The flood came. Every other human being died. Atrahasis and his family survived. And when the flood waters receded and Atrahasis made offerings, the gods, who had been without offerings for the duration of the flood, they were described as gathering around the offering, smoke like flies. So desperate were they for the sustenance that human offerings provided. This is an extraordinary moment in the text. The gods who tried to exterminate humanity are described as desperately needing the offerings that only living humans can provide. The very act of genocide they attempted had deprived them of what they required from humans. They needed the humans they were trying to kill. Enlil was furious that Atrahasis survived. But the other gods, including the mother goddess, who had lamented the flood even as she participated in its authorization, argued for mercy. Enki reminded them of what they had learned. You cannot eliminate humanity without losing something you need from it. A more sustainable solution was required. And this is the crucial passage. The solution that was agreed upon, the compromise that resolved the conflict between the gods' need for human production and their fear of human excess, was a set of permanent structural modifications to human existence. 3 specific modifications. 3 additions to the design of humanity that would prevent the problem from recurring. First, the barren woman. The me of infertility was established. A certain proportion of women would be unable to bear children, limiting the natural reproduction rate of humanity. This was not described as a curse or a punishment. It was described as a design parameter, an administrative setting. Second, infant mortality. A certain proportion of human children would die before reaching reproductive age. This was built into the system as another population ceiling. Again, not as punishment, as design. Third, the institutions of celibacy, the devotional orders, the Natatu women, the cultic personnel who dedicated themselves to temple service and did not reproduce. Social structures that channeled a portion of humanity's generative energy into worship rather than reproduction. These were described as institutions deliberately established by the gods as part of the post-flood settlement. And underlying all 3 modifications, death. Human biological death, built into the biology of the species, ensuring that no human being accumulated long enough to threaten the divine order. The Atrahasis epic does not explicitly say that death was one of the post-flood modifications, because human mortality had already been established at the time of creation. But the framing of the settlement as a set of sealing mechanisms designed to keep the human population at a manageable level makes it clear that death is the foundational sealing mechanism on which all others depend. The Utnapishtim passage in the Gilgamesh epic makes this explicit. After Gilgamesh's failed attempt to obtain the bread of life, Utnapishtim tells him directly, the Anunnaki, the great gods, held their assembly. Mametum, the mother of fate, determined fate with them. They established both death and life. They did not reveal the time of death. They established both death and life. Death was established. It was not found. It was not already there waiting to be discovered. It was established, put in place. Written into the structure of reality is a me. And the me that governs death is held by the gods. It is in their hands. It could, in principle, be differently configured. The ascent from the underworld is also a me, meaning that the reversal of death is also a possible operation within the system. The Sumerians did not believe that death was absolutely irreversible in any metaphysical sense. They believed it was irreversible because the beings who controlled the relevant me did not permit reversal except under extraordinary circumstances. It was a policy, not a physical law. This has a parallel in modern biology that is both clarifying and deeply unsettling. For most of the history of biology, aging was considered the inevitable result of the second law of thermodynamics entropy, the tendency of ordered systems toward disorder applied to the biological organism. You age because you are a complex ordered system in a universe that tends toward disorder, and you cannot fight that tendency forever. Aging is built into the physics. It is not a design feature. It is a physical inevitability. This is not, it turns out, precisely correct. The aging researcher Aubrey de Grey, whose SENS, Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence framework, proposed systematic approaches to reversing the damage processes of aging, made a critical distinction that changed how serious researchers thought about biological mortality. He argued that aging is not a single process governed by an immutable physical law. It is a collection of specific damage mechanisms, 7 specific categories of damage, as it happens, which is again an interesting coincidence in light of the Sumerian 7 gates. The 7 categories de Grey identified are cell loss and tissue atrophy, mutations in chromosomal DNA, mutations in mitochondrial DNA, cellular senescence, intracellular junk, extracellular junk, and extracellular crosslinks. Each of these is a specific, identifiable, potentially reversible process. None of them is thermodynamically inevitable at the timescale of a human lifetime. They are the result of specific biological processes that were not selected against in evolution because they occur after reproductive age, but they are not inescapably required by physics. If aging is not required by physics but is instead a collection of specific damage processes that were not designed out of the human biological system, then it looks less like a physical constant and more like a design decision. Not necessarily a conscious, deliberate design decision. Evolutionary processes don't involve consciousness, but a design in the engineering sense. The organism is built in a way that produces these specific outcomes rather than different ones. The Sumerian claim that death was established, chosen, decided, implemented maps, in a structurally interesting way, onto the biological reality that aging and death result from specific biological parameters that could, in principle, be different. The Sumerian said, the Anunnaki chose these parameters. Modern biology says, the parameters exist, but are not thermodynamically required. The two statements are not incompatible. What modern biology cannot tell us is whether the parameters were set by unintelligent evolutionary processes or by something that had reasons for setting them that way. The Sumerians had a clear answer to that question. The parameters were set by the Anunnaki, and the reason they were set that way was to prevent humanity from becoming what the gods themselves were. We will examine that reason in full when we get to the 8th thing. For now, the 4th thing stands clearly. Your death was designed. The me governing mortality were established by the Anunnaki in a specific historical act that the Sumerian texts document. Those me could in principle be otherwise configured the Sumerian text document cases where they were. But they have been maintained in their current configuration because the beings who hold them have reasons for maintaining them. Reasons that serve those beings' interests rather than humanity's. The 4th thing the Sumerians said about death. Death is a divine administrative decision, not a natural law. It is a me, a design parameter of existence held and controlled by beings who established it for specific purposes. Those purposes were not your benefit, Those purposes were theirs. Thing 5. The permeable membrane communication between the living and the dead. The fifth thing the Sumerians said about death is one of the most practically significant and one of the most consistently suppressed by modern academic commentators. The barrier between the living and the dead is real, but it is permeable. Communication between the worlds was possible, not routinely, not casually, under specific conditions with specific mechanisms, producing specific results that the Sumerians treated as real information from a real place. Let's be precise about what this claim involves. The Sumerians did not believe that the dead simply lingered around as ghosts available for casual conversation. They did not believe that you could simply think hard about a dead person and receive their thoughts in return. The communication they documented was governed by the same administrative logic that governed the rest of the Sumerian cosmos. It required specific conditions, produced specific results, and operated through specific channels. The primary channel was the ritual system we've already discussed, the kispu, and the related obligations of the living toward the dead. But the ritual system was primarily one-directional. The living spoke to the dead, fed the dead, maintained the connection. The dead received. This was assumed without question. But the more remarkable communications went the other direction, from the dead to the living. And these were documented not as miracles, not as extraordinary divine interventions, but as the results of specific practices that the Sumerians understood and utilized. The most common mechanism was the dream. The Sumerians placed enormous emphasis on dreams as a channel of divine and supernatural communication. Entire texts were devoted to dream interpretation, not as a system of arbitrary symbols, but as a genuine framework for understanding messages received from the other side. And among the sources of dream communication, the dead were regularly listed. The Giddim could appear in dreams. They could speak. They could deliver information that the living did not already possess. The second mechanism was formal necromantic practice, the deliberate summoning of the Giddim for consultation. The Sumerian and Akkadian texts described this practice in enough detail that it was clearly a real social institution, not a literary fantasy. There were people whose function was to facilitate communication with the dead. There were rituals that established the conditions under which communication could occur. There were documented cases of such communication, producing information that was subsequently verified. The most important literary record of communication between the living and the dead is found in the Gilgamesh texts, specifically in the composition called Bilgamesh and the Netherworld, which appears in the standard Babylonian version of the epic as Tablet 12, and which some scholars believe was originally a separate composition attached to the Gilgamesh tradition. In this text, Gilgamesh has lost a sacred drum and drumstick objects that fell into the underworld. He is distraught. He weeps by the entrance to the underworld. The dead Enkidu offers to descend and retrieve the objects. Gilgamesh warns him carefully. If you go to the underworld, do not do these specific things, or you will not be able to return. He lists them. Do not wear clean clothes. Do not anoint yourself with oil. Do not throw a stick. Do not carry a weapon. Do not put on sandals. Do not make noise. Do not kiss the wife you loved. Do not hit the wife you hated. Do not kiss the son you loved. Do not hit the son you hated. If you do any of these things, if you do anything that marks you as a living person in a place of the dead will surround you and hold you there. Enkidu, characteristically, does all of these things. He wears clean clothes. He anoints himself. The dead surround him. He cannot return. Gilgamesh, devastated, appeals to the gods. He goes to Enlil, who refuses to help. He goes to the moon god Nana, who refuses to help. He goes to Enki. Enki opens a hole in the earth, a passage between the world of the dead and the world of the living. And Enkidu's spirit rises from the earth like a puff of wind from the ground. He appears before Gilgamesh, not in his living body, as a Giddim, as a shade. And then Gilgamesh asks. The question he asks is not sentimental. It is not, do you miss me? Or are you at peace? It is practical. It is the question of a man who knows he will eventually be joining the dead, and who wants every possible advantage in navigating that reality. Tell me, the order of the netherworld which you saw. And Enkidu tells him, in specific, practical detail, the condition of the warrior with 7 sons, he sits on a chair and drinks water. The condition of the court scribe, he performs the scribal functions in the divine assembly. The man who fell from the mast of a ship, his wife is weeping for him. The man who died suddenly, he was not given burial. The man whose body was abandoned on the steppe, his spirit has no rest. This catalog is not a story being told to entertain. It is information being transmitted from someone with direct knowledge to someone who wants to understand a specific reality. Gilgamesh treats Enkidu's account as eyewitness testimony, which, in the Sumerian framework, is exactly what it is. Let's examine for a moment the conditions that Enki established for Enkidu's return, specifically the hole in the earth that he opened. This is not described as magic in the theatrical sense. It is described as a specific action by a specific being who has the authority and knowledge to perform it. Enki opens a passage because he knows how to open a passage. The passage exists as a structural possibility within the cosmological system. It is possible to open it under the right conditions. What those conditions are, and who has the knowledge to create them, is part of what determines who can communicate across the death barrier. The ordinary living person cannot open such a passage. The ordinary necromantic ritual does not open such a passage. What the ritual system does is create conditions favorable to the kinds of communication that are possible without such passages. The dream communications, the near-death contacts, the experiences of presence that the bereaved report. These operate through the normal permeability of the barrier rather than through a forced opening. But the normal permeability of the barrier is real. The Sumerians documented it, built ritual systems around it, and treated the information obtained through it as reliable. Now let's look at the modern research context. The academic study of what are called after-death communications experiences reported by bereaved individuals of contact with deceased loved ones has been conducted systematically since the late 20th century. Researcher Bill Guggenheim coined the term and cataloged thousands of cases in his research. Researchers Erlendur Haraldsson and Carlos Osis conducted surveys across multiple cultures. The consistent finding is that a substantial portion, typically between 40 and 60%, depending on the population, studied of bereaved individuals report experiences of contact with the deceased that they did not expect, and that they find difficult to explain through ordinary mechanisms. These experiences are not confined to particular cultures, particular religions, or particular psychological profiles. They occur in places as culturally different as Iceland and Japan and the United States and India, with similar structural features across all of them. They occur to people who expected them, and to people who were explicitly skeptical of their possibility. They occur in states of waking consciousness, in sleep, and in the hypnagogic states between waking and sleeping. And they frequently contain information that the bereaved person did not already possess, information that, when subsequently investigated, turned out to be accurate. The case of Jane Smith, documented by Raymond Moody in his research on near-death experiences, involved a woman who, during a cardiac arrest, encountered her deceased father and a young man she did not recognize. The young man communicated to her that he was her brother, who had died in infancy before she was born, a fact her parents had never told her. She verified this with her parents after her recovery. They confirmed it. She had received accurate information about a real person whose existence she had no prior knowledge of. There are hundreds of documented cases with similar structures. Information obtained from apparent contact with the dead that turns out to be accurate, that the living person had no prior access to, and that cannot be explained by coincidence or unconscious knowledge. The Sumerians would not have been surprised by any of this. They built their entire ritual system around the assumption that such contact was possible. They documented it in their literature not as miracle but as expected feature of how reality works. The fifth thing the Sumerians said about death. The barrier is real but permeable. The living can reach the dead through ritual, attention, and the speaking of names. The dead can reach the living through the channels the cosmos permits: dreams, waking visions, and, under extraordinary conditions, formal communication established through specific mechanisms. The dead have information worth having because they inhabit a real place that has real conditions. And the information they transmit, when received and recorded, provides a map of a reality that the living will eventually enter. The Sumerians drew that map. They drew it from testimony. From the testimony of the dead themselves, transmitted through every channel the permeable membrane allowed. Thing 6. The judges of the dead, who they are, and what they are really doing. The sixth thing the Sumerians said about death involves a dimension of the underworld theology that is both the most administratively specific and the most difficult to integrate into any modern framework without confronting something genuinely disturbing. The dead are judged. Not in the moral sense that later traditions would develop, not in the Egyptian sense of the heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at, not in the Zoroastrian sense of good thoughts and deeds balanced on the Chinvat bridge, not in the Christian sense of a last judgment based on faith and works. The Sumerian judgment of the dead is something different, something that looks less like cosmic moral accounting and more like corporate HR processing new employees. The judges of the dead in Sumerian theology are called the Anunnaki of the Great Below, the Anunnaki who dwell in the underworld as their permanent domain. There are 7 of them, the 7 great judges, the 7 who pronounce judgment before the throne of Ereshkigal. They are named in some texts: Nana, Utu, Enlil, Enki, and others depending on the specific textual tradition. Their role is to assess each newly arrived shade and determine that shade's position in the hierarchy of the underworld. They look at who has arrived. They examine the shade's history, its circumstances, its social relationships, its manner of death, its burial conditions, and they allocate it to the appropriate position in the Kur's internal hierarchy. What they are not doing is moral assessment in any simple sense. There is no evidence in the Sumerian texts that a person who was kind and generous in life ends up in a better position in the Kur than a person who was selfish and cruel, all other things being equal. The factors the judges consider are social and structural. Your social status in life, the completeness of your burial, the number and quality of the people performing rites on your behalf, the manner of your death, your relationship to the divine institutions of Sumerian civilization. These are not moral categories, they are social categories. They say something about your position in the cosmic hierarchy, your relationship to the divine institutions, your embeddedness in the social network, your level of connection to the structures of civilization that the Anunnaki established. And based on these factors, you are allocated a position in the underworld hierarchy. There is a specific and revealing Sumerian text called The Death of Ur-Nama, named for an actual historical king of the 3rd dynasty of Ur who died around 2094 BCE, possibly in battle, that gives us an unusually detailed account of what happens to a king who arrives in the underworld. Ur-Nama arrives in the Kur. He mourns. He offers lavish gifts to the underworld gods. And then he begins to take his place in the hierarchy of the dead specifically, a position appropriate to his status as a former king. The text describes the underworld as having a hierarchy that mirrors the hierarchy of the living world. Kings in life maintain something of their royal position in death. Important officials in life maintain something of their official position in death. The hierarchy of the Kur is a dim, degraded reflection of the hierarchy of the living world appropriate to the diminished state of the Giddim, but structurally similar. This is administratively coherent. If the underworld is a functioning system and the Sumerians consistently described it as such, then it needs some form of organization. The judges allocate newly arrived shades to positions within that organization based on the qualities they bring with them from life, their status, their social connections, their relationship to the divine institutions. But why? Why does the underworld need to be organized? What function does its hierarchy serve? What is the underworld actually doing, as a system, that requires this level of administrative sophistication? Here we need to return to the context established in the third thing. The dead require sustenance, and the sustenance they receive is provided by the living through the ritual system. The flow of sustenance from the living to the dead is not random. It is directed specific offerings to specific dead persons, maintained through specific named relationships. The organizational structure of the Kur allows this directed sustenance to reach the appropriate recipients. The hierarchy maintains the order necessary for the system's efficient operation, but this is only a partial explanation. A system that simply needed to distribute incoming sustenance from the living to the appropriate dead would not need to be as elaborately organized as the Sumerian texts describe. It would not need 7 great judges assessing each newly arrived shade. It would not need a palace, a throne, a queen, and a complete administrative apparatus. What else is the underworld doing? Here is where the analysis becomes genuinely speculative, but speculative in ways that are grounded in the logic of the Sumerian system as a whole, rather than arbitrary. In the Sumerian cosmological framework, human beings were created to generate something that the Anunnaki required. In life, they generated this through labor, through offerings, through the worship conducted in the temples. The Sumerian word for the human obligation to the gods, ardu, means not devotion but service, not love but function. The human relationship to the gods was not that of a child to a parent. It was that of a worker to an employer, of a subject to a sovereign, of a created entity to its creator. And the things humans generated for the gods, the offerings of food and drink and precious materials, the labor of building and maintaining infrastructure, the worship that the hymns describe as feeding the gods, these were real. They were genuinely received. They had genuine effects on the gods who received them. Now, what happens to that generation after death? The shade in the underworld is diminished. It cannot work in the way the living person worked. It cannot build canals or cultivate fields or construct temples. Its capacity for the physical dimensions of the human labor relationship to the gods is gone. But something continues. The shade persists. It has some form of ongoing existence, and in the Sumerian framework, every existing entity is in some form of relationship to the cosmic hierarchy. Consider. The living person, through worship and offering, generated something that flowed upward to the gods. The dead person, as a shade in the Kur, is maintained by something that flows downward from the living, the offerings, the kispu, the spoken names. The direction of flow reverses at death. In life, the human generates upward. In death, the human receives downward. But the system as a whole, the entire chain from gods to living humans to dead humans, continues to flow. The gods at the top continue to receive from the living in the middle. The dead at the bottom continue to receive from the living in the middle. The living are in the middle, receiving from the gods above and providing to the dead below, while simultaneously generating for the gods above and being maintained by the system as a whole. The living person is the productive node in a system that extracts from them in both directions, upward toward the gods and downward toward the dead. And the productivity of the system depends on the living person remaining alive long enough to generate, but not so long that they accumulate enough to challenge the extractive relationship. Death, in this model, is not the end of the living person's function in the system. It is the transition of that function from the productive mode, generating upward, to the consumptive mode, receiving downward. The dead are the retirement population of a labor system no longer productive in the primary sense, but maintained at minimal levels as a kind of systemic continuity. And the underworld's organizational structure, its hierarchy, its judges, its administrative apparatus, is the management system for that retirement population. The judges assess newly arrived shades, not to reward or punish them, but to allocate them appropriately within the post-productive population management system. This is cold. It is very cold. It removes from death any dimension of justice, of meaning, of transcendence. It reduces the afterlife to a kind of cosmic social security system, a minimal maintenance fund for the post-productive dead, managed by the same beings who manage the living. The Sumerians understood this. Their death literature is suffused with a particular tone, not quite despair, not quite acceptance, but something closer to clear-eyed, unsentimental acknowledgement of how things are. The lament literature of Sumer is not the lament of people crying out to a god who loves them but has let them down. It is the lament of people who understand the system clearly enough to grieve it without illusion. In the great Sumerian lament texts, the lamentations over the destruction of Ur, the lamentations over individual loss, the philosophical dialogues about the meaning of suffering, there is a consistent undertone. The gods did this, the gods designed this, the gods built this system, and the gods are not primarily interested in our comfort within it. We exist to serve. We die when the system is done with us in our productive capacity. We persist in degraded form in the underworld because the system has ongoing minor uses for us there. And the judges who process us into that final degraded persistence are themselves Anunnaki, members of the same group of beings who created us and who designed the system we live and die within. This is not theology in the sense of a tradition that offers comfort. This is theology in the sense of a tradition that offers accuracy. The Sumerians cared more about being accurate than about being comforted. The sixth thing they said about death: the dead are not simply received by the underworld. They are judged, sorted, and allocated to positions within an organized system by divine beings, the Anunnaki of the underworld, whose function is administrative rather than judicial in any moral sense. What they are administering is a population management system, a system that maintains the post-productive dead at minimal levels, a system that was designed by the same beings who designed human existence from the beginning. To call it mercy would be inaccurate. To call it justice would be inaccurate. To call it the predictable outcome of a system designed for purposes other than human flourishing would be, according to the Sumerian texts themselves, correct. Thing 7. The heroes who refused and what the system did to them. The seventh thing the Sumerians said about death is contained in their stories of the heroes who refused it. Not the heroes who faced death bravely, every tradition has those. Not the heroes who made peace with mortality and chose a meaningful life over meaningless immortality, every philosophical tradition has those too. The heroes we are talking about are the ones who looked at the entire architecture of the death system we've been examining, the Kur, the 7 gates, the designed mortality, the administrative machinery, and said, "I do not accept this. I will find another way." These heroes are important not just as literature, but as documentation. Documentation of what happens when a human being reaches the threshold of defeating death, what the system does in response, and what the outcome reveals about the nature and robustness of the design. The central figure is Gilgamesh. But Gilgamesh's story requires understanding what preceded his quest, specifically the death of Enkidu and what that death meant to a man who had, until that moment, lived at the absolute peak of human power and capacity. Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk. He was, in the language of the tablets, 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal. a hybrid of the divine and human that gave him capacities beyond ordinary humans. He was described as the most beautiful of men, the most powerful of warriors, the most accomplished builder, the most famous of kings. He was the peak of what the Sumerian human-divine hybrid lineage could produce. And he was utterly unprepared for the death of his companion. Enkidu was not simply Gilgamesh's friend. He was his equal, which for someone like Gilgamesh was an extraordinary thing. The tablets describe Enkidu's creation specifically as a response to Gilgamesh's excess. He was oppressing the people of Uruk, channeling his superhuman energy into behavior that was destroying the city he was supposed to protect. The goddess Aruru created Enkidu from clay and set him in the wilderness, a wild man, fully human in body but raised among animals, without civilization, without language, without the socializing structure of urban life. He was Gilgamesh's mirror image. Where Gilgamesh was the apex of civilized humanity, Enkidu was the distillation of natural humanity. Their meeting, their wrestling, their friendship, their becoming inseparable is one of the great relationships in world literature. Together they went on extraordinary adventures. They killed the bull of heaven that Anu sent to destroy Uruk. They killed the monster Humbaba who guarded the cedar forest. They were, together, a force that nothing could stop. But the gods decided that one of them had to die. The divine assembly convened and made the judgment. For killing the bull of heaven and Humbaba, someone must be punished. The two of them had overreached. They had done things that the divine order had not sanctioned, had achieved things that the design of human capacity was not supposed to allow, and the punishment decided upon was the death of Enkidu. Enkidu got sick. Urses. He lay in his bed for 12 days, weakening. And in those 12 days, he dreamed of the underworld. He saw it. He described it to Gilgamesh in terms that are among the most desolate in ancient literature, the land of darkness, where dust is their food and clay is their bread, where they do not see light, where they sit in darkness. He saw there the great kings who once ruled, now serving the underworld as servants. He saw there the priests and the scribes. He saw there what he himself was becoming. On the 13th day, Enkidu died, and Gilgamesh was, for the first time in his life, stopped. Not by a monster, not by a divine punishment, by grief, by loss, by the realization that the one thing he could not fight, could not outrun, could not overpower was the fact of death itself. Enkidu was gone. And Gilgamesh, who was 2/3 divine, who had defeated everything the world had put in his path, was going to die too. The tablets record his recognition explicitly. Now what is this sleep which has seized you? You have become dark and do not hear me. He raised his eyes and looked at the heavens. He wept and grieved greatly. He refused to allow Enkidu's burial. He sat with the body. He waited. Maybe it wasn't final. Maybe there was something that could be done. He sat until a worm fell from Enkidu's nostril. And then he knew. He put on a lion skin and set out across the wilderness. Not to mourn, not to make peace with mortality, to defeat it. The quest of Gilgamesh is not about finding wisdom or accepting death or discovering that life has meaning even though it ends. Those are interpretations that have been imposed on the story by scholars who are more comfortable with the acceptance of mortality reading than with what the text actually says. What Gilgamesh is doing is trying to not die. He is looking for the technology of immortality that he has heard exists somewhere with Utnapishtim, the man who survived the flood, the man who was given immortality by the gods as part of the post-flood settlement. Utnapishtim knows. He has done it. He has the information Gilgamesh needs. The journey to find Utnapishtim is extraordinary. Gilgamesh crosses through the twin mountains where the sun rises and sets the mountains guarded by the scorpion men, beings who are terrifying in form but who ultimately let him pass because they recognize something in him. He travels through 12 double hours of complete darkness, darkness that is not just the absence of light but something more absolute, the darkness beyond the edge of the living world. He comes out the other side and finds the waters of death, the sea that separates the living world from the place where Utnapishtim lives. He meets the divine barmaid Siduri, who lives on the shore of the sea, and she tells him what every wise being in the story tells him: give up. You are looking for something that cannot be found. The gods made death for humans when they created them. They kept life for themselves. You, Gilgamesh, are a human however extraordinary. You cannot have what the gods have. Go back, eat and drink. Make merry. Look at the child who takes your hand. Let your wife delight in your embrace. These are the things given to mortals. Do not try to exceed what has been given. Gilgamesh ignores this advice. He finds the boatman Urshanabi and crosses the waters of death in a way that requires cutting down hundreds of poles to push the boat across, so that the waters never touch his hands, because if the waters of death touch him, He will become what they represent. He crosses. He finds Utnapishtim. He asks his question. Utnapishtim looks at him. He sees a man who has done something impossible, has crossed the waters of death while still living. He sees someone who has overcome every obstacle the system put in his way. He sees the peak of human potential, desperate and grief-ravaged, and absolutely committed to defeating the thing that cannot be defeated. And he tells him, the Anunnaki established death and life. They did not reveal the time of death. This is how it is. This is how the gods designed it. But then because Utnapishtim's wife intercedes, because even in the most administrative of divine frameworks there is space for compassion, or at least for the gesture of compassion, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about the plant at the bottom of the sea. The plant that can restore youth, the plant of heartbeat, the plant that makes you young again. It is not immortality, but it is something. A reversal of aging, a postponement, a purchase of time. Gilgamesh dives to the bottom of the sea. He ties stones to his feet and walks on the seabed. He finds the plant described as thorny, painful to grasp, cutting his hands. He takes it. He holds the plant of youth in his wounded hands. And he does not eat it. We need to stop here and examine this moment very carefully, because it is the hinge point of the entire story, and it is a moment whose strangeness has been consistently under-examined. Gilgamesh has just done something that no human being has done. He has crossed the waters of death alive. He has found Utnapishtim, the only human with immortality. He has been told about a plant that can restore youth. He has found the plant. He has it in his hands. He is holding it. He went to the bottom of the sea and cut his hands on its thorns to get it, and he does not eat it. His stated reason is practical. I want to test it first. I will carry it back to Uruk and test it on an old man. If it restores his youth, I will eat it myself. If not, I will have lost nothing but the plant. This is the reasoning of a careful, scientific-minded person. It is the reasoning of someone who has been deceived before, who knows that gifts in this context can be traps, that what appears to be the answer can be the mechanism of failure. He wants verification before committing. But this reasoning, under the circumstances, is almost incomprehensible. He is at the ends of the earth. He is on the wrong side of the waters of death. He is in a place where no human has ever been and where he will never be again. If there were ever a moment to simply eat the plant and verify through direct experience, this is that moment. He has nothing to lose and everything to gain. Unless he had been conditioned not to trust immediate miraculous gifts. Unless the entire tradition he had been raised in, the tradition that said the gods designed traps for human beings who reach for too much, had made him specifically cautious at precisely the moment when caution was not warranted. This is the exact same structure as the story of Adapa. Adapa was cautious when he should have consumed. Gilgamesh is cautious when he should have consumed. In both cases, the caution is based on previous experience of divine deception. Enki told Adapa the bread of life was the bread of death. The tradition that Gilgamesh carries warns him that divine gifts can be traps, and in both cases, the caution produces the worst possible outcome. Adapa refuses the bread of life. Gilgamesh holds the plant of youth and does not eat it. On the journey back, Gilgamesh stops at a pool to bathe. He sets the plant down on the bank, and a snake, sensing the plant's fragrance, drawn by whatever quality the plant of youth possessed, rises from the water and takes it. The snake swallows the plant. The snake sheds its skin, its old form, and slips back into the water, renewed. The snake has what Gilgamesh sought. The snake will be young again. Gilgamesh will age and die. He sat down and wept. The tablets record his exact words. He says to his boatman Urshanabi, the only witness to his catastrophic failure, "For whom has my heart's blood been spent? For whom has my heart's blood been spent? I have not obtained any good deed for myself. The lion of the ground has seized it for himself." The lion of the ground, the snake. In every ancient mythological system that has been examined in any depth, Sumerian, Egyptian, Hebrew, Greek, Indian, Mesoamerican, the snake is associated with the same constellation of meanings: transformation, regeneration, the ability to shed an old form and take a new one, connection to the earth and its secrets, and crucially association with the gods, with divine knowledge, with the beings who possess what humans lack. In Genesis, it is a serpent that offers the forbidden fruit of knowledge to the humans in the garden. In the myth of Gilgamesh, it is a serpent that takes the plant of youth. In the Egyptian tradition, serpents are the guardians of the underworld and the companions of the gods. In the Vedic tradition, the Nagas, serpent beings, are ancient, powerful entities with knowledge of the underground world. The snake in the Gilgamesh story gets the plant of youth. The snake, the representative of the divine or quasi-divine order that governs the natural world and the underworld, takes the thing that would have given Gilgamesh what the gods have. Takes it, uses it, benefits from it, while Gilgamesh goes home to die. Is this coincidence? Is it simply a convenient narrative device? The plant is lost, the story ends, the lesson of human mortality is confirmed? Or is the snake's role in this story, like the snake's role in the Genesis story, not incidental but structural? Is the presence of the serpent at both critical moments of human access to immortality, the garden and the sea, the fruit and the plant, a record of something? A record that the beings associated with serpents in these traditions were involved in preventing human access to immortality at the critical moments? We cannot be certain. The texts do not say so explicitly. But the structural parallel is striking enough that dismissing it requires a level of confidence in coincidence that seems unwarranted. Gilgamesh returned to Uruk. He looked at the walls of his city, the great walls he had built, the walls of baked brick that would outlast any human life, and the poem ends with him pointing to those walls. The last lines of the standard Babylonian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh return to the walls of Uruk, their dimensions, their beauty, their endurance. The walls are what remains. The name inscribed on the walls is what continues. The work that outlasts the worker is the Sumerian consolation for death. It is a consolation. But it is only a consolation because the alternative, actually not dying, was placed within Gilgamesh's reach and then removed at the critical moment. By circumstances that, if you examine them carefully, have a specific structure, the hero is conditioned by prior experience of divine deception to be cautious about miraculous gifts, and that conditioned caution produces the failure at the critical moment. Someone conditioned him to be cautious. That conditioning produced the failure. The failure served the interests of the system that needed him to die. The documents recording this failure were preserved with extraordinary care, pressed into clay tablets that survived more than 3,000 years, found in the ruins of Nineveh, translated, published, read by millions of people. The lesson of Gilgamesh is supposed to be, accept mortality. It is the human condition. Make peace with it. Build your walls. Leave your name. This is wisdom. But there is another reading available. And it requires only reading the text for what it says rather than what commentators tell you it means. The text says, a human being of extraordinary capacity reached the threshold of defeating death. He had the mechanism of defeation in his hands. He was conditioned not to use it. A serpentine entity associated with the divine order took it from him. He went home and died. The seventh thing the Sumerians said about death. The most powerful human being who ever lived tried to defeat it and failed not because he lacked the courage or the capacity, but because the system is robust against exactly this kind of challenge. It accounts for human exceptionalism. It has fail-safes for the person who can cross the waters of death. It has fail-safes for the person who finds the plant of youth. The conditioning to distrust miraculous gifts is the fail-safe, the insurance policy against human beings, who are exceptional enough to reach the threshold, but whose very exceptionalism makes them suspicious of what they find. There. The system was not designed to be defeatable by the most extraordinary human being who ever lived. It was designed to be specifically robust against that possibility. And the documentation of that robustness, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the most widely translated literary work from the ancient world, was preserved, carefully, in clay, for 3,000 years, until we found it. As if someone wanted the record of the failed challenge to endure as long as the challenge endured. Thing 8. The one nobody wants to hear, human mortality, was designed to prevent human transcendence. We have arrived. Let me tell you what the 8th thing is not. It is not a secret known only to initiates. It is not encoded in obscure texts available only to specialists. It is not discovered through esoteric reading or numerological decoding or any interpretive system that requires you to go beyond what the tablets actually say. The 8th thing is in the primary sources. It is in the most mainstream, most widely translated, most academically accepted Sumerian and Akkadian texts. It is stated plainly, in the language of administrative fact, by people who were writing down what they understood to be historical reality. The 8th thing is this. Human beings were created mortal on purpose, specifically, deliberately, as a designed feature rather than a natural inevitability. And the purpose of that deliberate mortality was to prevent human beings from becoming what their creators were: powerful, accumulating, long-lived, potentially rival beings who could not be controlled, who would not need to serve, who would exist outside the system of extraction and management that the Anunnaki had built. Death is the mechanism by which human beings are prevented from becoming what the Anunnaki did not want them to become. Let me walk through the full textual basis for this claim, because it is important to be precise about what the tablets actually say. We have already established from the Atrahasis epic that human beings were created as a labor force specifically to replace the Igigi who went on strike. The purpose of human creation was service, labor, the maintenance of cosmic infrastructure that the Anunnaki civilization required. We have established from the Utnapishtim passage in the Gilgamesh epic that the Anunnaki, the great gods, held their assembly, and Memetum, the mother of fate, determined destiny with them. They established both death and life. They did not reveal the time of death. Established, not discovered, not accepted as inevitable. Established, as a deliberate act. The story of Adapa adds the crucial third element. Adapa was created by Enki with complete understanding. He was the most accomplished human being of his age, wise, skilled, the one who Enki had shaped most carefully. When he came to the attention of the great god Anu and was summoned to the heavens, the food and drink of eternal life were offered to him. And Enki, his creator, his protector, the one who had given him more than any other human, advised him not to eat, not to drink, told him that what would be offered in heaven was the food and drink of death. It was not. The divine food and drink offered in Anu's court was the bread of life and the water of life. Adapa refused them, as Enki had instructed, and confirmed his mortality. Enki lied to him. Now let's examine why Enki lied. And here is where we have to be very careful, because the text does not provide an explicit reason. Enki does not turn to another god and explain his motives. The motivation must be inferred from the logic of the situation. Enki created Adapa with complete understanding. He was proud of Adapa. The texts describe a relationship of care and attention. Enki was Adapa's patron, his teacher, his protector. In other texts, Enki is consistently described as humanity's greatest divine friend, the one who advocates for humans, who warns Atrahasis before the flood, who helps humans survive the disasters Enlil sends. Enki is the most pro-human deity in the Sumerian pantheon. And yet Enki prevented his most accomplished human creation from obtaining immortality when it was offered by the king of the gods himself. The only coherent explanation, the one that the logic of the entire Sumerian theological system supports, is that Enki understood, more clearly than any other deity, what an immortal human being would mean for the divine order. Enki was the one who designed the parameters of human creation. He knew what the parameters were set to prevent. He knew that complete understanding, combined with immortality, produced something the system was not equipped to manage. Complete understanding alone is not a threat. You can have complete understanding and still be mortal. You will simply understand things perfectly until you die, and then you will be a very wise shade in the Kur. Useful, perhaps, in certain ways, but contained, bounded, within the system. Immortality alone is not necessarily a threat either. An immortal being without complete understanding might simply accumulate experience without the capacity to deploy it effectively. The threat for the Anunnaki was the combination. An immortal being with complete understanding in Anu's exact words in the text, a being who has become like one of us, would be outside the system. Outside the system of mortality that contained humans. Outside the system of service and extraction, a peer, not a subject. Enki prevented that combination from occurring. Not through force. Force would have been impossible, since Anu himself was offering the bread of life. Through the more elegant and more reliable mechanism of prior conditioning, by telling Adapa not to eat, by giving him a reason that seemed credible based on his experience of divine deception, since gods did sometimes offer humans harmful things disguised as gifts, Enki ensured that Adapa would refuse the one thing that would have freed him from the system. This is the most disturbing aspect of the entire Sumerian death theology. Not that humans were made mortal, not that death is designed rather than natural, but that the mechanism of maintaining human mortality involves the active, deliberate, repeated deception of the most accomplished and most trusted humans by the deity most associated with human welfare. Enki is supposed to be humanity's friend. And in many ways, the texts suggest he genuinely is. He is the one who warns Atrahasis before the flood, the one who helps humans survive Enlil's destruction campaigns, the one who creates the two beings that rescue Inanna from the underworld. He is genuinely more pro-human than the rest of the Anunnaki, but he is also the one who created humans as a labor force in the first place. He is the one who designed the parameters of human existence that included mortality. And he is the one who, when the king of the gods offered his most accomplished human creation the chance to escape those parameters, actively intervened to prevent it. Enki's relationship to humanity is not that of a parent who wants their children to grow and eventually surpass them. It is that of a creator who genuinely cares about the well-being of what he created, while simultaneously needing it to remain within parameters that serve his own civilization's interests. He is, in the most nuanced possible sense, a benevolent manager. not a tyrant, but also not an unconstrained benefactor. A manager who maintains the parameters of the system, even as he mitigates the worst of its impacts. This is the eighth thing. But it has implications that extend far beyond what the Sumerian texts themselves say, and those implications are where the "one nobody wants to hear" quality comes from. If human mortality was designed, if it is a divine administrative code, established for the purpose of preventing humans from accumulating enough time and capacity to become what their creators were, then the question of whether that design can be overcome is not a question about biology. It is a question about power, about who holds the me of mortality, about whether those me can be obtained, modified, or circumvented by beings who were not the intended recipients of their authority. In the Sumerian mythology, Inanna stole the me from Enki. She got him drunk, and he gave them to her one by one, and when he sobered up and sent demons to retrieve them, she had already delivered them to her city of Uruk. Me can change hands. They can be stolen. They can be given as gifts under conditions their holder did not anticipate. The fact that the me of mortality have remained in the hands of the appropriate divine administrators throughout recorded human history does not mean they are metaphysically locked there forever. It means that no human has yet obtained access to them. Not Adapa, who was offered the bread of life and refused it. Not Gilgamesh, who found the plant of youth and lost it to a snake. Not Utnapishtim, who obtained immortality but was placed at the ends of the earth where his example could not be broadly replicated. The record of near misses is a record of the system's robustness, but it is also a record that the system is not impenetrable. The near misses were real. The mechanisms that prevented them from succeeding were specific and contingent. Enki's lie, Gilgamesh's conditioned caution, the opportunistic snake. These were not thermodynamic necessities. They were specific events with specific actors. Different events, different actors might have produced different outcomes. Now let's bring this all the way to the present. Because the eighth thing, human mortality as designed prevention of human transcendence, has implications for the modern world that are among the most significant any ancient text has ever generated. Modern aging research, as we discussed in the section on the fourth thing, has established that biological aging is not a thermodynamic inevitability. It is a collection of specific damage processes that were not selected against in evolution because they occur after reproductive age. David Sinclair's work at Harvard on epigenetic reprogramming has demonstrated that aging can be partially reversed in animal models. Aubrey de Grey's SENS framework has mapped the specific damage categories and proposed interventions for each. Research groups at institutions from the Salk Institute to the Babraham Institute to the Calico Life Sciences Company funded by Google are actively pursuing what amounts to the same goal Gilgamesh pursued: defeating biological death. These researchers encounter cultural resistance that is disproportionate to their actual scientific claims. The resistance is not primarily scientific. It comes from a deep cultural conviction that human mortality is appropriate, that it is natural, right, fitting, perhaps spiritually necessary. This conviction is not derived from empirical evidence. It is not the conclusion of careful reasoning about the consequences of human longevity. It is a prior conviction that functions more like a religious axiom: humans should die. Where does that axiom come from? Every major religious tradition enshrines death as appropriate, natural, or spiritually necessary. Every major cultural narrative framework uses death as the terminal that gives life its structure and meaning. Every institutional system that governs human society is built on the assumption of human mortality, social security, inheritance law, estate planning, the entire apparatus of life insurance and death benefits. The assumption of human death is so deeply embedded in every layer of civilization that challenging it feels like an attack on civilization itself. The Sumerian framework suggests a specific and disturbing answer to the question of where this cultural conviction comes from. If the Anunnaki designed human mortality and then designed the civilizations that humans would build, if the me of kingship, the me of law, the me of religious institution, the me of all the social structures that govern human life, were established by the Anunnaki and given to human civilization as its operating parameters, then the cultural conviction that death is appropriate and natural would have been built in, not as an afterthought, as a core design feature. The civilizations the Anunnaki established would teach their participants to accept death as natural, because that acceptance was what the design required for the system to function without constant challenge. The divine institutions, the temples, the priesthoods, the oracles, the religious traditions that preserved and transmitted the theological frameworks within which ordinary humans understood their existence, all of them, in the Sumerian framework, derived their authority from the me given to them by the Anunnaki. They were administrative channels of the same system that designed human mortality. They would naturally, as part of their function, teach the acceptance of what the system required. This is not conspiracy in the dramatic paranoid sense. It is system design. A well-designed system teaches its own participants to accept its parameters as natural and appropriate. The fish doesn't question water. The human doesn't question death. Both experiences feel like the unquestionable background of existence, because they have been the constant background for so long that questioning them requires stepping outside the framework that made them seem unquestionable. But here is what the Sumerian texts give us: the documents of the framework's designers. The records of the beings who designed the system and the reasons they designed it. And those reasons stated explicitly in texts that have been translated, published, and available to anyone who reads them include preventing human beings from accumulating enough to challenge the divine order. Reading those texts is stepping outside the framework. It is the moment when Adapa could have eaten the bread of life, the moment of recognition before the conditioned response kicks in, the moment of seeing the water for the first time. What do you do with that recognition? The Sumerians themselves did not have a clear answer. Their literature is full of the recognition of people who understood that the system was what it was, designed by beings who did not primarily have human interests at heart, but not full of clear prescriptions for what to do with that recognition. The lament literature laments. The wisdom literature counsels moderation and acceptance. The heroic literature documents failure carefully and precisely. But there are hints. There are fragments of a different possibility, scattered through the edges of the tradition, that point towards something the Sumerian mainstream does not fully articulate. The most significant is the concept that appears in the most ancient Sumerian religious texts, the concept of the divine spark within the human being. The gods, in creating humans, mixed divine essence with clay. Something of the divine, however degraded, however diluted, was placed inside the human form. The tablets use different words for this in different contexts. The blood of a god, the intelligence of a god, the will of a god, the knowing of a god. But across all contexts, the consistent claim is that human beings contain, within their mortal frames, something that is not mortal in origin. What happens to that something at death? The Giddim that passes through the 7 gates loses everything else. The crown, the lapis stones, the necklace, the breastplate, the ring, the rod and line, the robe, everything associated with the living human person's status and identity and power is stripped away. But the divine essence that was placed inside the clay at creation, the blood of the slain god, the spark of divine intelligence, is it stripped too? Or is it what remains? Is the Giddim what remains precisely because it is the divine component, and the stripping process removes everything that was added by human social existence, leaving the original divine substance that was placed there before any of that existed? If the divine essence placed in humans at creation is what the Giddim consists of, then the Giddim is not a degraded human being. It is a degraded god. A god who has been reduced to shadow form by the 7-gate stripping process, reduced to the minimum expression of what it fundamentally is, but a divine being nonetheless, existing in the underworld in a diminished form that could, in principle, be restored. This is the reading that the Gnostic traditions, which emerged in the later Near East, drawing heavily on traditions that descended from the Sumerian, developed most explicitly. The Gnostic claim that human beings contain within them a pneuma, a spark of divine light that does not belong to this world, that was placed here by a creator whose interests and the spark's interests are not aligned, that can potentially be recognized and liberated even within the conditions of mortal existence. This is not a departure from the Sumerian framework. It is its most radical extension. And it points directly to what the 8th thing implies, beyond its immediate political and cosmological content. If human mortality is designed to prevent human transcendence, then the project of human transcendence is not impossible, it is merely contained. The container is robust. It is specifically designed against the most exceptional human beings, as the stories of Adapa and Gilgamesh demonstrate. But it is a container, not a wall, that extends to infinity in all directions. The mystics who said that the divine within can be recognized, can be cultivated, can be expanded beyond the limits that ordinary human existence imposes, they were, in the Sumerian framework, describing exactly what the me of mortality was designed to prevent: the transformation of the mortal human into something that the mortality system can no longer contain. Not through biological life extension, not through finding the plant of youth at the bottom of the sea. Through something that happens within the existing lifespan, a reorientation of consciousness toward what the Giddim fundamentally is, rather than what the living person added to it. A process of progressive recognition of the divine essence that was placed in the clay, which is, in the Sumerian framework, what survives the seven gates anyway, not enhanced, but revealed by the stripping process. This is the possibility that the tradition gestures toward without fully articulating, not immortality through accumulation of physical time, which is what Gilgamesh sought and what the me of mortality prevents, but something more fundamental: recognition of what you are at the level that cannot be stripped, even by the seven gates of the underworld. The eighth thing the Sumerians said about death: you are mortal, because someone decided you should be mortal, to prevent you from becoming what they were. Death is a management tool, a containment mechanism, a ceiling installed in the biology of the created species to prevent that species from accumulating enough time, enough knowledge, enough power to become what their creators were. This was stated explicitly. It was pressed into clay. It was preserved for thousands of years. It is available to anyone who reads the tablets. And the tradition that preserved this statement also preserved the hint of what the containment cannot contain, the divine essence placed in the clay at creation. The thing that is not human in origin, even in its most reduced and diminished form, even after the seven gates have stripped away everything that was added by human civilization and human social identity and human mortal experience. That thing, whatever it fundamentally is what the system was designed to keep manageable. That thing is what the eighth thing says you should be thinking about. What the eight things point toward? We have walked through all 8 of the things the Sumerians said about death. Let's stand back and look at the whole picture, because the whole is more than the sum of its parts. The Sumerians documented a system, not a religion, not a mythology, not a set of comforting stories about what happens after death, a system, an administrative, functional, specifically designed system with the following components: a destination, the kur, a real place, governed, administered, structured, with specific conditions for different categories of dead, a place that has been documented in its essential structural features by every subsequent civilization that examined the question of death carefully enough to leave us records. A stripping process, 7 gates that remove, one by one, every layer of identity associated with the living human person. The process is deliberate. Its result, the Giddim, the irreducible shade, is the operational unit of the underworld. A maintenance requirement. The dead require ongoing sustenance from the living to maintain their existence in the kur above the minimum threshold. The system of obligations between the living and the dead is legal, structural, continuous. A design mortality. The me governing death and life were established by the Anunnaki as a deliberate act. Human mortality is not natural in any thermodynamic sense. It is administrative. It can be otherwise. It has been otherwise in specific documented cases. A permeable barrier. The membrane between the living and the dead allows information to flow in specific conditions. The living can reach the dead. The dead can reach the living. The information flowing in both directions is real information about real conditions in a real place. An administrative apparatus. The Anunnaki judges of the underworld manage the post-mortem population. They are not engaged in moral accounting. They are engaged in resource management and organizational maintenance of a system that serves the interests of the beings at the top of the cosmic hierarchy. A robust containment. The most exceptional human beings who challenged the mortality system came close and failed. The failures were not random. They followed a specific pattern. The mechanism of defeat is placed within the hero's reach and then removed through a combination of prior conditioning and specific contingent events. The system is specifically robust against exactly the kind of human exceptionalism most likely to challenge it. And the reason for all of it: human beings were made mortal because immortal humans, with full development of their potential humans who had accumulated enough time, knowledge, and capacity, would be what their creators were, would be peers, would be outside the system of service and extraction, would not need the Anunnaki and could not be managed by them. Death is the mechanism by which that accumulation is prevented. Now, what does this mean? For most people encountering this framework for the first time, the immediate response is either dismissal or despair. Dismissal because it's easier to say it's just mythology than to follow the implications. Despair because if the framework is true, the situation seems bleak. You are a created entity within a system designed for your containment, operated by beings with capabilities far beyond yours, with mortality as the built-in ceiling that prevents you from ever accumulating enough to challenge the arrangement. But there is a third response, and it is the one that the tradition itself points toward. The tradition preserved not just the documentation of the system, but the documentation of the exceptions. Utnapishtim obtained immortality. Adapa was offered the bread of life. The plant of youth existed and was found. Inanna descended to the underworld and returned. Enki opened the hole in the earth through which Enkidu's shade could communicate. The system has seams, it has edges. It has moments where the impossible was almost achieved. And the tradition preserved these moments carefully, pressed them into clay that has outlasted every city those people built, made sure the record of both the containment and the near escape survived 3,000 years of civilizational collapse and archaeological silence. Why would you preserve the near escapes if you wanted the lesson to be there is no escape? You would preserve them because you wanted someone who came later, someone who found the tablets and could read them, someone who lived in a world where the reading of such tablets was possible, where the implications could be examined in light of new knowledge to know that the system is not absolute, to know that the mechanism of containment, while robust, has been approached by human beings who did not fail because it was impossible. They failed because of specific contingent events that could have gone differently. The information preserved in the tablets is operational. It is not mythology. It is the documentation of a system by people who understood the system from the inside, who wanted that understanding to survive, and who trusted that whoever found the tablets would know what to do with it. What do you do with it? The answer the tradition gives is not simple, but it is specific. The tradition says, know yourself. Know what you are at the most fundamental level. Know the difference between what the 7 gates will take from you and what they cannot touch. Know the divine essence that was placed in the clay, the component that is not the crown, not the lapis stones, not the ring of verified identity, not any of the things that the stripping process removes. Know what you are underneath all of that. Because what you are underneath all of that, the Gidam at its core, the divine essence at the center of the clay, is not a human being in the ordinary sense. It is, in the Sumerian framework, something that was never mortal in origin. The mortality was added. The clay was the framework. The divine essence placed within was something else. And something that was placed there by the Anunnaki, something of divine origin, however reduced, may be subject to different rules than the clay around it. The mystics of every tradition, derived from or adjacent to the Sumerian, have said exactly this, in the vocabularies of their own traditions. There is something within you that the system cannot fully contain. It is not your personality. It is not your social identity. It is not your memories or your achievements or your relationships. All of those will be stripped at the gates. It is something more fundamental. The recognition of that something, its activation, its cultivation, its full realization, within the span of the mortal life, may be the one operation the mortality system cannot prevent. Because the mortality system was designed to prevent accumulation across time, it was not designed or cannot be designed against the recognition that happens in an instant. The Gnostic moment, the moment of seeing clearly what you are underneath everything that was added. The moment that the 7 gates cannot strip because it is not located in any of the layers the 7 gates remove, this is not a comfortable insight. It does not resolve into an easy spiritual practice or a clear path that anyone can follow. It is, rather, a direction, a pointing toward. The Sumerians, who documented everything else with such extraordinary precision, did not document this with the same clarity, possibly because they could not, possibly because the documentation of the system was more achievable than the documentation of its limits, possibly because the recognition they were pointing toward is by its nature not documentable in the way that administrative systems are. But they pointed. They preserved the pointer carefully in clay for 3,000 years. And the pointer is there to be read, now, by anyone who can read it. The final reckoning, let's come to the end. The Sumerians lived between 3,500 BCE and approximately 2,000 BCE, before their civilization was absorbed by the Akkadians who came after them. In those 1,500 years, they pressed into clay tablets an account of reality that is still being fully translated, still being fully understood, still generating new implications in the hands of researchers across many disciplines. They documented the creation of human beings. They documented the purpose of that creation. They documented the structure of the cosmos, the hierarchy of divine beings, the organization of earthly civilization, the relationship between the divine and the human. And they documented, in more detail than any subsequent tradition has attempted, the structure of death. All 8 of the things they said about death are documented in texts that have been translated, published, and made available to anyone who wishes to read them. They are not secret. They are not encoded. They are in the primary sources. What is secret? What has been quietly managed? Not through any dramatic conspiracy, but through the simple operation of institutional inertia, academic convention, and the cultural reflexes of discomfort is the full implication of these 8 things taken together. The individual pieces have been published. The synthesis has been avoided. We have attempted the synthesis here. The synthesis says, The Sumerians documented an administered cosmos in which human beings are created entities whose existence, including their death, is governed by divine administrative codes held by beings with interests that do not prioritize human flourishing. The system has been maintained through recorded human history. The mechanism of its maintenance includes the conditioning of humans to accept mortality as natural and appropriate, the active prevention of exceptional humans who challenge that mortality, and the construction of religious and cultural frameworks that reinforce the acceptance of what the designers wanted accepted. And underneath all of this, at the center of the clay into which the divine essence was mixed, there is something that the system cannot fully contain. This is the inheritance the Sumerians left us. Not a religion, not a mythology, a map. A precise, detailed, and administratively accurate map of the system we live and die within, drawn by the people who had the most direct access to its designers. Every generation since the tablets were found has had the opportunity to read that map. Most have not. Those who have read it have often been dismissed as conspiracy theorists, or credulous mythologizers, or enemies of proper academic methodology. But the tablets are still there. The clay is still intact. The wedge marks pressed into it 4,000 years ago by hands that understood what they were preserving are still legible to anyone who has learned to read them. The Sumerians built the walls of Uruk. Those walls are gone. The Sumerians built their tablets. Those tablets endure. They endure because someone made sure they would. Because someone pressed the clay hard enough, and fired it hot enough, and buried it deep enough that it would survive until the people who needed to find it could find it. That someone had reasons for making sure the record survived. The record includes all 8 of the things the Sumerians said about death. It includes the one nobody wants to hear. And it includes very quietly, in the edges and the margins and the gestures of a tradition that documented everything else with such terrifying precision, the hint that the system built to contain us is not the end of the story. Only the beginning of the question of what you are underneath the crown, the lapis stones, the necklace, the breastplate, the ring, the measuring rod, and the robe. The question of what passes through all 7 gates and still exists. The question of whether what was placed in the clay at the beginning, the divine essence, the intelligence of the slain god, the something that was not clay to begin with, is subject to the same rules as the clay around it. The Sumerians pressed that question into clay 4,000 years ago. They pressed it hard. They made sure it would last. They left it for you to find. The wider world of death. How the 8 things echo across civilizations. Before we close entirely, there is a dimension of the Sumerian death theology that demands more time than we have given it, the extraordinary degree to which its specific features, its structural claims, and even some of its most obscure details appear in traditions that have no documented connection to Sumer. This is not the kind of parallel that can be waved away with the standard academic gesture of universal human responses to mortality. These are specific, structural, administratively precise parallels. And taking them seriously changes what we understand about the history of human civilization. Let's start with Egypt, because Egypt is the civilization most familiar to Western audiences when it comes to sophisticated ancient death theology, and because the relationship between the Sumerian death system and the Egyptian duat is both more extensive and more puzzling than mainstream Egyptology typically acknowledges. The duat, the Egyptian underworld, is described in extraordinary detail in the Amduat, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, and other funerary texts that were inscribed on royal tomb walls from the New Kingdom period onward. The Amduat, whose name means that which is in the underworld, describes the journey of the sun god Ra through the 12 hours of the night, during which he passes through the duat, encounters its inhabitants, and is reborn at dawn. But the duat described in these texts is not just Ra's nightly transit, it is the underworld where the human dead exist permanently. The structural parallels with the Sumerian Kur are extensive. The duat is underground, the dead travel downward into it. It is divided into regions 12 in the Amduat, corresponding to the hours of the night. But the general principle of regional division exactly mirrors the Sumerian structure. It has gates. The Book of Gates specifically describes 12 gates, each guarded by a serpent guardian, each requiring specific knowledge to pass. It has a ruler, Osiris, the king of the dead, who, like Ereshkigal, did not choose his domain but was given it through cosmic distribution. It has judges, the 42 assessors of Ma'at, who question the dead in the Hall of Two Truths. It has a water barrier, the dead cross waters to reach the Duat, and the sunboat in which Ra travels through the underworld crosses the primeval waters of the Nun. The most striking parallel is the judging process, specifically the Hall of Two Truths and the weighing of the heart. In this famous scene, the heart of the deceased, representing their entire earthly life and character, is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the principle of cosmic truth and right order. If the heart weighs more than the feather, it is consumed by the composite beast Ammit and the soul is destroyed. If it weighs less than or equal to the feather, the deceased passes into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. Now, here is what is interesting. The weighing of the heart is typically presented as Egypt's great moral judgment system, the innovation that added ethical accountability to the afterlife. And compared to the Sumerian system, it appears to be more morally sophisticated. The Sumerian judges don't weigh moral virtue. The Egyptian judges do. So perhaps the Egyptians developed an improvement on the Sumerian model, a more just, more morally sophisticated version of the divine judgment of the dead. But look at the feather of Ma'at more carefully. Ma'at is not simply goodness in any vague moral sense. Ma'at is the principle of divine order of everything being in its right place in the cosmic hierarchy. A heart that weighs against Ma'at is not a heart that was unkind or dishonest in the ordinary human sense. It is a heart that existed outside the proper order of things. That was disordered. That did not fit the cosmic hierarchy. In other words, the moral criterion of Egyptian judgment is not individual ethical conduct in the way we typically understand ethics. It is alignment with the cosmic order as defined by the divine hierarchy. A heart that weighs well against the feather of Ma'at is a heart that lived in proper relationship to the divine hierarchy of Egypt, to the pharaoh, to the gods, to the institutions of civilization. A heart that does not weigh well is a heart that disrupted that hierarchy. This is exactly the same criterion as the Sumerian system, expressed in different vocabulary. The Sumerian judges assess social and structural position, your relationship to the divine institutions. The Egyptian judges assess Ma'at, your alignment with the divine order. Both systems are assessing the same thing. How well did you fit within, serve, and support the system designed by the gods? Neither system is assessing individual virtue in the autonomous sense. Neither system is asking, were you kind, were you generous, were you honest as an expression of your own moral character? They are asking, were you properly positioned within the system we built? This is not a coincidence. Too sophisticated, independent ancient civilizations developing the exact same underlying criterion for their judgment of the dead, disguised in different imagery, but structurally identical, is not what independent parallel development looks like. It is what transmission from a common source looks like. And the common source, the Sumerian texts suggest, was the Anunnaki themselves. The administrative criteria for judging the dead are the same in Sumer and Egypt, because both traditions descended from the same theological reality, the same beings designed both systems, and both designs serve the same function, ensuring that the dead were sorted according to their utility and their alignment with the divine hierarchy, not according to any independent moral standard. The Egyptian tradition adds an additional element that is worth examining: the concept of the Ka and the Ba. In Egyptian death theology, the human being was understood to consist of several components that were not all the same, that separated at death and that had different fates. The Ka was the life force, the animating energy that kept the body alive. At death, the Ka left the body and had to be maintained through offerings in the tomb. The Ba was something closer to the personality or soul. It could move between the land of the living and the land of the dead. It could attach to and leave the body. The Akh was the transfigured spirit, what the deceased became after successful completion of the afterlife journey, a shining, powerful, divine being. The most significant of these for our purposes is the Akh. Because the Akh is explicitly described as what the successfully transfigured dead person becomes, and the word Akh is related to the word for radiance, for light, for the shining quality of the divine, the Akh is not a degraded shade. The Akh is a transfigured being with divine attributes. In other words, the Egyptian tradition, unlike the Sumerian, which focuses primarily on the Giddim as a degraded remainder, contains within it the explicit possibility of the dead being elevated rather than merely sustained. The transfiguration of the deceased into the AKS is described not as a possibility for the few, but as the aspiration of the entire funerary program. The elaborate embalming, the spells of the Book of the Dead, the rituals of the opening of the mouth, all of it is directed toward producing the Akh, the elevated, transfigured, divine quality being. But there is a catch, and it is one that aligns precisely with the Sumerian framework. The production of the Akh was not automatic. It required specific preparation, specific ritual, the correct performance of specific procedures that had to be performed by the correctly initiated. The wrong performance, the wrong spells, the wrong sequence of rituals, and instead of the Akh, you got a degraded shade, something closer to the Giddim. In other words, the possibility of transcendence in the Egyptian system was real, but it was contained within a specific ritual framework controlled by the priestly class, which was itself part of the divine administrative system established by the gods. The path to the AK was mediated by institutions created by the same divine authority that created the death system in the first place. And those institutions were administered by human beings who were the representatives of the divine hierarchy on earth, the pharaoh, the priests, the sacred institutions of Egyptian civilization. Access to the possibility of transcendence was available, but only through channels that the divine administrative system controlled. This is a more sophisticated version of the containment that the Sumerian system describes. In Sumer, the possibility of escaping mortality is simply denied. The heroes who reach for it fail. In Egypt, the possibility of transcendence is offered but through a system that the divine hierarchy controls, that requires specific institutional mediation, and that therefore keeps the possibility of transcendence safely within the administration of the very powers that maintain the system of containment. You can become an AKH, but only if you navigate the system correctly, and the system is administered by us. The Greek tradition adds another layer. The development of Platonic philosophy, which was explicitly influenced by Egyptian mystery traditions, as Plato himself acknowledged, introduced a different framework for understanding death and the soul that appears, at first, to be more liberating than either the Sumerian or Egyptian model. In Plato, the soul is immortal, not contingently immortal, not immortal because someone granted it immortality, or because the correct rituals were performed. Intrinsically immortal. The soul was immortal before this life and will be immortal after it. The body is the prison, or at best, the vehicle. Death is liberation from the body, not a journey to a managed realm. This sounds very different from the Sumerian model. In the Sumerian model, the soul, the Giddim, is specifically not immortal in any robust sense. It is diminished, requires maintenance, degrades without sustenance. It persists, but in a condition that is clearly worse than living, not better. But look at what Plato says about most souls after death. They do not simply go free. They do not ascend immediately to the realm of pure forms and live in perfect philosophical bliss. They go to Hades, the Greek underworld, which is structurally identical to the Sumerian Kur. They are judged. They spend time in the underworld appropriate to their earthly lives. And this is the element that the Sumerian and Egyptian traditions don't include. They are reincarnated. They choose a new life and return to the mortal world. Only the truly philosophical soul, the soul that has, through genuine philosophy, which in Plato's technical sense means the dedicated practice of clearing away illusion and approaching truth, sufficiently purified itself, only that soul escapes the cycle of reincarnation. Only that soul moves toward genuine liberation. The structure here is interesting. The Platonic soul is intrinsically immortal, but its immortality is expressed not as a single post-death existence in the underworld, but as a cycle of deaths and rebirths that continues indefinitely until the soul has achieved sufficient philosophical purification. The system of containment in the Platonic model is not a single underworld managed by administrators. It is a cycle of repeated lives, repeated deaths, repeated returns to mortal experience, each cycle, another opportunity to accumulate the philosophical understanding that could eventually break the cycle. From the Sumerian framework's perspective, this is a more sophisticated version of the same containment. The Sumerian system says, you have one life, you die, you go to the Kur, you are maintained at minimal levels. The Platonic Orphic system says, you have many lives, each ending in death, each beginning again in a new mortal body, and you remain within this cycle until you achieve the specific state of understanding that the cycle was apparently designed to produce. In both cases, mortality or the cycle of mortality is the mechanism that keeps souls engaged with the mortal system. In the Sumerian model, death is terminal and the soul is managed in the underworld forever. In the Platonic model, death is cyclical and the soul is recycled through mortal experience repeatedly. But in both cases, the soul is contained within a system. And in both cases, there is a specific condition under which the containment can be escaped. In Sumer, by obtaining the plant of youth, or the bread of life, which the heroes fail to do, and in Plato, by achieving genuine philosophical understanding, which very few souls manage to do before the cycle ends. The Indian traditions, specifically the Upanishadic and later Buddhist frameworks, present what might be the most developed version of this same structure. In the Vedic and Upanishadic traditions, the concept of samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth, is the fundamental context of mortal existence. The soul, Atman, is intrinsically divine. It is, in the deepest Upanishadic teaching, identical with Brahman, the ultimate reality. But it exists within the cycle of samsara, through the force of karma, the accumulated weight of action and intention that keeps it engaged with mortal experience. The escape from samsara moksha is liberation from the cycle. It is the recognition of the Atman's true nature as Brahman, the moment of complete identification with the ultimate reality that dissolves the illusion of separate individual existence and, with it, the accumulation of karma that drives reincarnation. When the illusion is fully dissolved, the cycle stops. The liberated soul does not return to mortal existence. It is free. Notice the structure. There is a fundamental divine nature within the human being. Atman equals Brahman. That divine nature is obscured by something by Maya, by illusion, by the sense of separate individual existence. And there is a path specific, difficult, requiring sustained practice and genuine understanding through which the obscuration can be removed and the divine nature can recognize itself. That recognition is liberation. This is the same structure as what the Sumerian tradition gestures toward in its edges and margins. The divine essence placed in the clay at creation, the component of human beings that is not human in origin. The progressive stripping of the 7 gates which removes everything that was added by mortal existence, leaving only the fundamental thing. The possibility, gestured at but never fully articulated in the Sumerian texts, that recognizing what the Giddim fundamentally is might be the one operation the mortality system cannot prevent. The Indian tradition developed this possibility into the most complete philosophical framework for it that human civilization has produced. And it did so, importantly, completely independently of the Sumerian tradition, in a geographic and cultural context where direct transmission from Sumer is not documented, unless what the Vedic tradition preserved was not transmitted from Sumer but from the same source that Sumer itself accessed. The same original theological reality, transmitted through different channels, producing in different vocabularies, and through different cultural lenses, the same essential insight. There is a divine component to human consciousness that the mortality system was designed to contain, and the recognition of that component is the one operation available within mortal existence that transcends the system's containment. The Buddhist elaboration of this insight, the Buddha's teaching that the fundamental nature of consciousness is awareness itself, which is not born and does not die, which is not created and cannot be destroyed, which is simply what represents perhaps the cleanest and most precisely argued version of what the Sumerian tradition said in its most obscure and tentative gestures. The Buddha did not frame his teaching in terms of gods who created humans as labor forces. He did not engage with the Anunnaki or the Kur or the Me of mortality. He spoke from direct investigation of his own consciousness, and what he reported from that investigation was, the mortality system samsara is real. It operates. It is maintained. But it is maintained by ignorance, by the failure to recognize what consciousness fundamentally is. And that ignorance can be dissolved, not gradually, not through accumulation of time and knowledge and power. In a moment of direct recognition, the Sumerian tradition and the Buddhist tradition are saying the same thing in radically different languages. The Sumerian version, at the center of the clay there is something placed by the gods that is not the clay. The Buddhist version, at the center of experience, there is awareness that is not any of the contents of experience. Both are pointing at the same recognition. Both are saying that this recognition is available within mortal existence to anyone who makes it their genuine focus. Both are saying, though, the Sumerian texts say it more quietly, that this recognition is the one thing that the system of containment cannot prevent. Because the system of containment was designed against accumulation over time, against living long enough to develop capabilities that would make you dangerous to the divine hierarchy. And the recognition they're pointing at doesn't require time. It doesn't require accumulation. It is available at any moment to anyone as soon as the obscuration that prevents it is removed. This is why the wisdom traditions that have survived, the traditions that have maintained genuine insight rather than becoming purely institutional, have consistently focused not on living longer, but on seeing more clearly. Not on defeating death through accumulation, but on defeating the system of ignorance through which the mortality cycle maintains itself. And it is why those wisdom traditions have consistently been marginalized, absorbed into institutions that manage them, stripped of their most radical content, and delivered to their participants in forms safe enough that the genuine recognition they point toward is rarely achieved within their institutional frameworks. The system is not merely biological. It operates through culture, through religion, through the institutions of civilization itself. It maintains itself through the same channels through which it was originally established, the divine institutions that the me of kingship, the me of law, the me of religious tradition, the me of everything that governs human civilization, were given to humanity as the framework of its existence. Those institutions reliably produce acceptance of the system they were given to maintain. The wisdom traditions that point toward genuine liberation are the anomalies, the exceptions. The places where something leaked through the framework, some transmission of the core recognition that was not fully absorbed and managed by the administrative apparatus. The Sumerian tablets are another such anomaly. Written at the foundation of the administrative civilization, written by the people closest in time and relationship to the beings who designed the system they contain, in their administrative precision, both the documentation of the system and, in their edges and gestures, the hint of what the system cannot reach. That hint has survived in the clay for 4,000 years, surviving everything that the administrative apparatus of human civilization has built and destroyed and built again in the interim. Still there, still readable, still pointing at the same thing that the Buddha pointed at 2,000 years later, that the Upanishadic sages pointed at 3,000 years later, that the Gnostics pointed at 2,000 years later, that the Sufi mystics and the Christian contemplatives and the Taoist sages all pointed at in their own vocabularies across the entire history of human civilization's attempt to understand what it is and what contains it. All of them pointing at the same thing. All of them saying, it is here, not somewhere else, not in a future time or a different life or an improved biological substrate. Here, now. In whatever you are, at the center of what you can strip away. The Sumerians were the first to write it down. They wrote both the containment and the hint of what the containment cannot reach, in the same careful wedge marks, on the same clay tablets, in the same civilization that built the first cities and wrote the first laws and pressed the first poetry into the first written language our species produced. They did this for a reason. The reason is the eighth thing. And the eighth thing points, in its final and most important gesture, not toward despair, but toward the recognition that was, from the beginning, the one thing the design system of human mortality could never quite contain. The scholar's problem. There is one more dimension of this subject that deserves attention: why the academic mainstream has consistently failed to engage with the full implications of the Sumerian death theology and what that failure tells us. The study of Sumerian civilization is a legitimate and rigorous academic field. Sumerologists, specialists in the Sumerian language, texts, and culture, have produced extraordinary work over the past century and a half of Assyriology as a discipline. The translations of major Sumerian texts by scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer, Thorkild Jacobson, Bent Alster, Jeremy Black, and many others are foundational contributions to our understanding of the ancient world. But there is a consistent pattern in how Sumerian death theology is treated in the mainstream academic literature. The descriptive work is done well. The texts are translated. The ritual practices are documented. The literary analysis of major works like the Descent of Inanna and the Epic of Gilgamesh is sophisticated. What is not done, what is carefully avoided, is the synthetic analysis that takes all of these elements together and asks, what is this, taken as a whole, saying about the nature of death, consciousness, and the designed conditions of human existence? That question is avoided, and the avoidance is not random. It follows a consistent pattern. When Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as beings who came from somewhere else and established civilization, the academic commentary says, this is a mythological explanation for the origins of civilization, reflecting the universal human tendency to attribute the achievements of one's own culture to divine intervention. When Sumerian texts describe the creation of humans as a labor force through a process that sounds disturbingly like genetic manipulation, the commentary says, this is a creation myth. All cultures have creation myths. This is the Sumerian version. The details are symbolic. When Sumerian texts describe human mortality as explicitly designed to prevent humans from accumulating enough to challenge the divine order, the commentary says, this is a theological claim reflecting the Sumerian understanding of the relationship between gods and humans. The gods are more powerful than humans. The theological framework accounts for this difference by making it permanent. Every time the Sumerian texts say something that would, if taken literally, require a fundamental re-examination of what human beings are and what the history of our existence actually is. The academic commentary produces an interpretation that contains the claim within the category of mythology and prevents it from escaping into the category of historical documentation. This is not conspiracy. Scholars are not meeting in secret rooms to decide which aspects of Sumerian theology to suppress. What is happening is something more subtle and more systematic. The institutional framework of academic inquiry has parameters. Those parameters include the basic assumption that the ancient texts are mythological rather than historical when they make claims that do not fit the standard model of human civilizational development and cosmic nature. That assumption functions as a filter. It prevents the synthesis that would otherwise be obvious. The filter is the academic equivalent of the conditioning that prevented Adapa from eating the bread of life. It is not a lie, exactly. It is a prior framework that makes a specific kind of recognition unlikely by framing the relevant information in a way that prevents the recognition from occurring. Independent researchers, people who have examined the Sumerian texts outside the institutional framework of professional Assyriology, have produced the synthesis that mainstream scholarship avoids. Not all of their work has been rigorous. Not all of it is correct. The field of ancient astronaut research includes a great deal of speculation that goes far beyond what the texts actually support, and it includes a great deal of credulous acceptance of evidence that would not survive careful scrutiny. But the core claim that the Sumerian texts, when taken seriously as historical documentation rather than mythology, describe a reality in which human beings were created by more advanced beings, in which human mortality was deliberately designed by those beings for specific reasons, and in which the structure of death that the Sumerians documented reflects something real about the conditions of human existence. This core claim is defensible, not proven, not beyond reasonable challenge, but defensible in ways that the mainstream's confident relegation of it to mythology is not. What would it take to settle the question? Honestly, more evidence. The evidence we have, the textual record, the archaeological record, the comparative analysis of ancient traditions, is consistent with the core claim, but not sufficient to prove it beyond doubt. The honest position is that the evidence warrants serious investigation and serious discussion, neither credulous acceptance nor reflexive dismissal. What the mainstream academic response does, reflexive relegation to mythology without engaging with the full weight of the evidence, is not the honest position. It is the position of people operating within an institutional framework that has specific parameters, specific assumptions, and specific costs for anyone who challenges them. The researchers who have challenged them, Zecharia Sitchin most famously, but also Lloyd Pye, Michael Cremo, Graham Hancock, and others in adjacent fields, have paid significant institutional costs. Their work has been dismissed, ridiculed, excluded from peer-reviewed publications, and associated in the public mind with the most credulous and least rigorous forms of alternative history. Some of that dismissal is deserved. The most credulous and least rigorous of their specific claims should be scrutinized and rejected. But the core claim should be engaged with, not dismissed by association. What the Sumerians wrote deserves to be read. What it says deserves to be heard. And the implications of what it says deserve to be examined all the way through, without stopping at the comfortable point where the implications become difficult. We have tried to do that here, not to prove anything, not to establish that every detail of the ancient astronaut hypothesis is correct, but to follow the Sumerian texts where they lead all the way to the eighth thing and through it to the question it raises on the other side. The tablets are in museums. They are in the British Museum, in the Louvre, in the Oriental Institute in Chicago, in the National Museum of Iraq, in collections around the world. They can be visited, they can be read. The major texts are available in translation to anyone who searches for them. The Descent of Inanna, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis epic, the story of Adapa, the story of Bilgamesh, and the Netherworld, all of them are in print and in digital form. The Sumerians pressed them into clay so they would last. They did last. They are here. What you do with them is your decision. The archaeology of the death system. There is a physical dimension to Sumerian death theology that hasn't been adequately addressed in our narrative so far, the archaeological record of how the Sumerians actually treated their dead, and what that physical record tells us about how seriously they took the 8 things they believed. The Great Cemetery at Ur, excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s, is one of the most significant and disturbing archaeological sites in human history. It is significant because of its extraordinary wealth of grave goods, gold and silver vessels, lapis lazuli jewelry, musical instruments, weapons, clothing that give us an unparalleled picture of Sumerian material culture at its height, around 2600 to 2400 BCE. And it is disturbing because of the royal tombs. The royal tombs at Ur were not ordinary burial sites. They were enormous underground chambers built of stone and brick, accessed through burial shafts that contained not just the body of the deceased king or queen, but the bodies of their attendants. Dozens of people, in some cases more than 60, buried alongside the royal dead. Woolley's initial interpretation was that these were sacrificed servants who were killed to accompany the king into the afterlife. But a closer examination of the bodies, their arrangement, their lack of injury consistent with violent death, the presence of cups that may have contained poison or sedative substances suggested a different picture. It appears that the attendants went into the tomb alive. They arranged themselves carefully. They may have drunk something. And then they died, peacefully or at least voluntarily, in service to their royal master. This is the Sumerian belief system made physical. The attendants who accompanied the king into death were performing the most extreme possible version of the social obligation to the dead, rather than maintaining the kispu and speaking the king's name and making offerings at his tomb. They were actually following him into the Kur to serve him there as they had served him here. Why would they do this? Why would dozens of people walk into a sealed underground chamber and die in order to accompany their king into the underworld? The only answer that makes sense within the Sumerian framework is that they believed it. They believed the Kur was a real place, where the dead continued to exist, where social hierarchy persisted, where the king would need attendants as he had needed them in life. They believed that their service in the underworld was meaningful, that it had real consequences for the king whose retinue they were completing. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was not mythology. For the people who walked into that burial chamber and drank that cup, the Sumerian beliefs about death were as concrete and as operational as any belief system has ever been. They acted on those beliefs with their lives. And the physical record of that action, the carefully arranged bodies, the grave goods, the sealed chambers, is still there. In the storage facilities of the British Museum and the National Museum of Iraq, available to anyone with research access. The Sumerians believed the 8 things deeply enough to die for them, to organize their entire civilization around them, to write them down in thousands of clay tablets that they preserved with extraordinary care, to build their ritual systems around the maintenance of the dead through regular offerings and the speaking of names, to construct their laws around the obligations of the living to the dead. This is not the behavior of a civilization entertaining a mythology for entertainment or comfort. This is the behavior of a civilization that had been told something specific, by beings they understood to have direct knowledge of the relevant reality, and that organized every dimension of its existence around taking that knowledge seriously. The archaeological record corroborates the textual record. And together, they form an evidentiary base that is extraordinarily difficult to dismiss simply as mythology, the Sumerian legacy and later tradition tracing the stream. The influence of Sumerian death theology on subsequent religious traditions is documented by mainstream scholarship but rarely discussed in terms of its full implications. The standard academic treatment acknowledges the influence and then moves on, as if influence were simply a matter of literary borrowing rather than potential transmission of an underlying theological reality. Let's trace the stream more carefully. The Hebrew Bible, compiled in its current form between approximately 800 and 400 BCE, drawing on oral traditions and earlier written sources that certainly go back much further, contains multiple elements that are direct borrowings from Sumerian and Akkadian sources. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented and acknowledged by mainstream biblical scholarship. The flood story in Genesis, Noah and the Ark, the divine decision to destroy humanity, the survival of one righteous family. The Rainbow Covenant is almost identical in structure, and in many specific details, to the Atrahasis epic and to the flood section of the Gilgamesh epic. The borrowing is explicit enough that the discovery of the cuneiform versions in the 19th century constituted what one scholar called the most exciting and disturbing event in the history of biblical studies. The creation story in Genesis, the Garden of Eden, the Tree of Knowledge, the serpent, the expulsion from paradise, has direct structural parallels with the Sumerian story of Adapa. The Tree of Life in Genesis corresponds to the bread and water of life offered to Adapa. The serpent who precipitates the expulsion from paradise corresponds to the serpent who takes the plant of youth from Gilgamesh. The divine concern that humans will become like one of us, stated explicitly in Genesis, is the same concern that underlies the entire Sumerian system of designed human mortality. The Hebrew concept of Sheol, the underworld, where the dead exist as dimly conscious shades called Rephaim, is structurally identical to the Sumerian Kur. Sheol is underground. The Rephaim are diminished. They require some form of sustenance or attention from the living. They can be communicated with under specific conditions. The famous episode of Saul consulting the witch of Endor, who summons the shade of Samuel, is a Hebrew necromantic practice entirely consistent with the Sumerian understanding of communication with the dead. And the Hebrew gods' concern about human immortality, expressed explicitly in the Garden of Eden story, as the reason for the expulsion, is the same concern that Anu expresses when confronted with the possibility of an immortal Adapa. He has complete understanding. Now, if he were to obtain the plant of life as well, he would be like us. The linguistic scholar and biblical revisionist scholar Michael Heiser has documented extensively that the Hebrew word Elohim, usually translated simply as God in Genesis, is grammatically plural and refers throughout the Hebrew Bible to a divine council of beings, not a single deity. The divine council of Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible maps directly onto the divine assembly of the Anunnaki in the Sumerian texts. The structure of divine governance is the same. The decision-making process by council, by assembly, by collective determination is the same. The content of the decisions, including the decision to create and then to limit and ultimately to destroy humanity, is the same. This does not mean the Hebrew God is simply the Sumerian Enlil. The relationship between the traditions is more complex and more interesting than simple substitution. But it does mean that the Hebrew theological framework grew directly from the Sumerian theological framework, and that the specific claims the Sumerian framework makes about human existence, including the claim about designed mortality, are present in the foundational document of the three largest monotheistic religions in the time: world. The implications of this are ones that the religious mainstream has consistently avoided. If the God of Genesis expresses the same concern about human immortality as the Anunnaki Council in the Sumerian texts, if the decision to prevent human access to the Tree of Life is made for the same reasons that the Anunnaki established the Me of mortality, then the theological framework of the world's largest religions contains, within it, the same claim we identified as the eighth thing, not as a fringe interpretation, as a foundational narrative. The Christian tradition, built on the Hebrew Bible, then constructed, on top of this foundation, a specific theological response to the eighth thing. The central claim of Christianity that God became human and died, specifically defeating death from the inside, can be read as a direct engagement with the eighth thing. If human mortality is designed containment, then the incarnation and resurrection of the divine in human form is the first instance within the tradition of the containment being genuinely defeated, not approached and failed as Adapa and Gilgamesh failed, but defeated, from the inside, by something that was both fully within the mortal system and fully outside it simultaneously. The Gnostic Christians, whose texts were buried at Nag Hammadi in Egypt and discovered in 1945, pushed this logic to its extreme. In Gnostic theology, the creator of the physical world, the demiurge, is explicitly identified as a being of limited power and vision, not the ultimate divine reality. The demiurge created human beings for his own purposes, not for the benefit of the divine spark imprisoned within human consciousness. The material world, including the death that terminates mortal existence, is the demiurge's creation and the divine spark's prison. The Gnostic salvation gnosis, the direct knowledge of one's true divine nature, is liberation from the demiurge's system. It is the recognition of the divine spark that the demiurge's creation was designed to contain. And the Gnostics were explicit that this recognition was available within mortal existence, that it did not require biological immortality, did not require finding the plant of youth, did not require any physical escape from the mortality system. It required only the direct recognition of what you fundamentally are, which the mortality system was built to prevent, but which was, in the Gnostic view, also what every human being's fundamental nature was pointing toward. The demiurge of the Gnostics maps precisely onto the Anunnaki of the Sumerians. The divine spark of the Gnostics maps precisely onto the divine essence placed in the clay by the Anunnaki at the time of human creation. The gnosis that liberates maps precisely onto the recognition that the Sumerian tradition gestures toward in its most careful and subtle moments. The Gnostics were, in this reading, the tradition that most clearly synthesized the Sumerian eighth thing into a practical program for human beings living within the mortality system. And the mainstream Christian church spent 3 centuries destroying Gnostic communities, burning Gnostic texts, declaring Gnostic theology heresy, and systematically eliminating from the Christian tradition the very element that most directly engaged with the eighth thing's implications. The Nag Hammadi texts, preserved in clay jars buried in the Egyptian desert, surviving more than 1,500 years of being officially non-existent, were found in 1945 by a peasant who was digging for fertilizer. They contained, among other things, the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of the sayings of Jesus that includes teachings so different from the canonical Gospels that they either represent a more original tradition than the canonical texts or a radical alternative. Development of Jesus' teaching. The Gospel of Thomas contains no narrative, no death, no resurrection, no institutional church. It contains only sayings. And those sayings are consistently pointing at the same thing the Sumerian tradition gestures toward in its edges: the recognition of what you are, at the level the 7 gates cannot strip. The kingdom is inside you and all around you. Split a piece of wood and I am there. Lift a stone and you will find me. Not in the afterlife, not after death, not in the properly administered system of posthumous reward, in the wood, in the stone, here, now, in the direct recognition of what is always already present underneath everything that was added. The Gospel of Thomas was buried in a clay jar in the Egyptian desert and survived 1,500 years because someone made sure it would. The same logic that pressed the Sumerian tablets hard into clay and fired them in the kiln pressed the Gnostic Gospels into a clay jar and buried them in the desert. Someone wanted these specific records to survive, to be found, to be available when the world produced people who could read them and needed what they contained. That is not mythology. That is intention. Specific, deliberate, long-term intention. The intention of people who understood what they were preserving and why it needed to survive. The stream from Sumer, to Akkad, to Babylon, to Egypt, to the Hebrew Bible, to Gnostic Christianity, to the Nag Hammadi texts, is not a stream of mythology drifting from culture to culture as ancient stories do. It is a stream of a specific recognition, the recognition of what human beings are, at the level that the system of containment cannot reach, transmitted across thousands of years by people who understood that the recognition was dangerous to the system and would not survive without deliberate protection. The clay tablets, the clay jars, the same material, the same action. Press the understanding in, seal it, bury it where it will last. The understanding lasted. It is here. It is available. What you do with it is your decision. But making that decision requires knowing what it is. And knowing what it is requires reading the 8 things the Sumerians said about death, the most ancient, most precise, most administratively specific account of the system of human existence and its limits that our species has produced. All 8 things, including the one nobody wants to hear, especially that one, because that one is the one that changes what all the others mean, and the one that points from within the oldest writing system our species ever developed toward what has been pointing back at us from inside human consciousness since the beginning, the thing that was placed in the clay that is not the clay, the thing that the 7 gates cannot take, the thing that the Anunnaki built the death system to contain, and that the death system, for all its 4,000-year robustness, has never been quite able to fully extinguish. That thing is here. That thing is what you are. The Sumerians knew it. They pressed it into clay. They made sure it lasted. Now you know it too. What you do next is up to you. Final reflection. The clay and what it contains. Sumer is gone. Its cities are mounds of earth in southern Iraq. Its canals are silted up. Its temples are dust. The great ziggurat of Ur still stands in partial form. Visitors can still climb its broad ceremonial staircase and look out across the flat Mesopotamian plain from its summit. Still, imagine the priests who climbed this same staircase 4,000 years ago, carrying offerings to the divine beings they understood to be real. But the tablets are here, in museums, in digital archives, in the editions and translations of scholars who have spent their careers in the careful and painstaking work of reading the oldest writing our species produced, in the books on the shelves of libraries around the world, in the hands of anyone who reaches for them. The Sumerians understood something about the relationship between material preservation and the survival of understanding. They had, of all the materials available to them, chosen clay. Clay is not the most impressive writing surface. It is not as beautiful as papyrus or parchment. It is heavy, brittle when unfired, and requires specific conditions for long-term survival when fired. But it endures. Unfired clay tablets, when covered by the collapse of a building and buried under accumulated earth, can survive indefinitely. The collapse that destroys the building protects the tablets. The earth that buries the city preserves what was inside it. The very catastrophes that end civilizations become the mechanism of preservation for what those civilizations most carefully recorded. The Sumerians seemed to understand this. They did not write their most important theological and historical records on perishable materials. They pressed them into clay. The tablets that have survived are not the incidental records, the shopping lists, the agricultural accounts, the business transactions, though thousands of those have survived too, giving us an extraordinary picture of daily life in ancient Mesopotamia. The tablets that have survived include the theological records, the cosmological records, the accounts of the Anunnaki, the stories of Inanna and Enki and Enlil, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Descent, the Atrahasis, the story of Adapa. The most important things were pressed into the most durable material, as if someone understood that the most important things would need to survive a very long time before they could be properly read. A very long time has passed. The tablets have been found. They have been read. They are being read now. 8 things the Sumerians said about death. All of them documented. All of them specific. all of them part of a coherent system that describes not just what happens when you die, but why it happens the way it does, and whose interests are served by it happening that way. The place you go, the stripping that gets you there, the sustenance you need when you arrive, the design nature of your mortality, the communication that is possible across the barrier, the administration that manages what you become, the robustness of the system against the greatest human challenges to it, and the one nobody wants to hear, that you were made mortal on purpose, by specific decision, because the beings who made you understood that an immortal, fully developed version of you would be what they were, and they were not willing to have peers where they had servants. These 8 things are in the clay. They have been waiting for 4,000 years. They are here now. The question the Sumerians pressed into the clay, alongside all 8 things pressed into the edges, the margins, the gestures that the administrative precision of their documentation could not quite contain, is this. Now that you know what the system is, and who designed it, and why, and what it cannot reach, what are you going to do with the life you have? Not the afterlife. This life. The mortal span you have been given within the system designed to contain you. What are you going to do with it, knowing what the clay knows? The Sumerians didn't answer this question. Not directly. They documented everything they could document and left the question alive, in what remained undocumentable. The question is still alive. It has survived everything else that the 4,000 years between them and us has contained. It is here, in you, waiting. The civilization that wrote its own limits. There is one final observation worth making about the Sumerians as a civilization, not just as the authors of a remarkable death theology, but as a people whose entire existence seems to have been oriented toward a specific act of preservation. Think about what they chose to record. They had, like all civilizations, practical needs that required documentation. Agricultural records, tax rolls, trade ledgers, marriage contracts, legal disputes. They recorded all of these things, and thousands of such tablets have been found and translated, giving scholars an unusually detailed picture of daily life in ancient Mesopotamia. But alongside all of that given equal and in some cases greater care, they recorded the theological cosmology, the creation stories, the stories of the Anunnaki, the descent of Inanna, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis, the story of Adapa, the lists of the Me, the funerary liturgies, the lament literature, the wisdom dialogues. They pressed all of it into clay with equal care. They stored it in temple libraries. They trained scribal schools specifically to maintain the tradition of recording and preserving it. The Aduba, the Sumerian scribal school, was one of the most important institutions in Sumerian civilization, producing not merely clerks and accountants, but custodians of the entire written record of what the Sumerians understood about the nature of reality. The scribal tradition was highly conservative. Students copied texts exactly, not paraphrasing, not updating, not interpreting. Copying the exact words, the exact signs, the exact content as a primary discipline. This conservatism served a specific function. It ensured that what was written once was transmitted forward without distortion. It was a system designed for fidelity of transmission across time. Why would a civilization that had a story to tell, a cosmological account, a theological system, a history of its relationship with its creators, develop an institution specifically designed to transmit that story forward with perfect fidelity? Why would they make the exact reproduction of the record the primary skill of their most educated class? Because they understood that the record mattered. That its survival, intact in its original form, was important in a way that went beyond the practical needs of any given generation. That what they had written down needed to reach forward past their own civilization's lifespan, past the languages that would change and the empires that would rise and fall over their buried cities to someone who could eventually read it and understand what it meant. The scribal tradition of Sumer was an act of communication across time, not the ordinary communication that civilizations perform for their own contemporaries and immediate successors, something with a longer intended reach. Something pressing into clay hard enough to survive not 1 or 2 generations, but hundreds, thousands. The tablets found at Nineveh were not contemporary with the Neo-Assyrian Empire whose library they filled. They were copies, carefully made copies of texts that were already ancient when the Assyrian scribes reproduced them. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its standard Babylonian version, found in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, was copied from older Babylonian versions, which were themselves based on older Akkadian versions, which were themselves based on Sumerian originals. A chain of deliberate, careful, exact copying that stretched across more than 1,000 years before the tablets were buried in the destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE, and lay there for another 2,500 years before Austin Henry Layard's excavations uncovered them in the 1840s. The survival of these texts is not an accident of archaeology. It is the result of deliberate, systematic, multi-generational effort by people who understood that what they were preserving was worth preserving across whatever span of time it took to find an audience capable of understanding it. Who that audience was, whether it was us, in this specific moment of history, or some future generation we have not yet produced, the Sumerians could not have known. They could only ensure the fidelity of the record and trust the clay to do its work. The clay has done its work. The record is here. The audience, for better or worse, with all the confusion and distraction and competing interpretive frameworks that characterize our particular historical moment, is us. What the Sumerians recorded about death is the most ancient, most detailed, most internally consistent account of the death system that human civilization has produced. It includes a cosmology, a creation narrative, a theology, an eschatology, a ritual system, a legal framework, a philosophical framework for understanding the relationship between the living and the dead, and 8 specific things documented, describable, examinable about what death is, how it works, why it was designed the way it was, and what it was designed to prevent. All of it is in the clay. All of it has been waiting. 8 things. One of them, the one nobody wants to hear. Now you have heard it. The Sumerians pressed it into the clay for you, specifically for whoever was patient enough, curious enough, willing enough to sit with the full weight of what the tablets say, rather than the comfortable summary of what we're told they mean. You have been patient enough. The clay has delivered its message. What happens next is not in any tablet. It is in what you do with what you now know.